Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
And now, A Mighty Long Way.
Prologue. Remembering Central High, 50 years later. All week, I managed to keep my composure. Through the touching anniversary speeches by politicians and civil rights leaders, through the lunches, dinners, and a reception at the Arkansas governor's mansion, through a provocative musical drama that told the story of the Little Rock Nine, even through a preview of the new visitor center for the high school, where the real-life drama took place 50 years ago. Through it all, I hardly shed a tear. I walked around the multimedia exhibits inside the center and watched the black and white television footage captured on that day, September 25th, 1957. But something wouldn't let me linger. I didn't want to see the 14-year-old black girl climbing those steps in her new store-bought dress, surrounded by armed military men under presidential orders to keep the spitting, clawing white mob at bay. I didn't want to know her fear again. Then, on the last day of city-sponsored events celebrating the golden anniversary of the Little Rock Nine, President Bill Clinton cracked my armor. As I sat on a makeshift stage at the foot of the steps that I had climbed the same day 5 decades earlier, the former president's words took me back. He was talking about courage, gratitude, and the responsibility that each of us has to contribute to the world, to do something more than talk, even when stepping up comes at a cost. He turned slightly away from the podium and looked sideways at us, the gray-haired men and women seated behind him. These 9 people didn't just have an opinion, he said. They didn't just say, wouldn't it be nice if someone did something to change things? These 9 people and their families stepped up and said, "Here am I, Lord. Send me." My lips started to quiver. Instinctively, my hands went up to cover them, as though they were a shield, as though they could keep back all the memories and pain. I thought about Mother, sitting out there in the audience, still beautiful and elegant at 82. And I remembered watching her soft, jet-black hair turn gray during that tumultuous and uncertain school year. I thought about Daddy, a devoted family man and World War II veteran who didn't live long enough to see this day. And I remember the chilling fear that crept into my soul when the FBI took him away late one night for questioning and held him for at least 2 days after our home was mysteriously bombed during my senior year. I thought, too, about Herbert, my childhood friend and neighbor who was convicted by an all-white jury for the bombing and served nearly 2 years in a maximum security prison next to death row inmates for a crime that I believe to my core he did not commit. I looked to my left and right on the stage and caught glimpses of my 8 comrades, my dear friends, some of whom are now grandparents. We'd come a mighty long way, and all 9 of us were still here. By now, nothing could keep back the tears. Here am I, Lord. Send me. Mother also knew the other black minister who was there, Reverend Z.Z. Driver, the father of one of my friends at Dunbar. She trusted these men, and I'm sure it comforted her to leave me in such good hands. 3 older white ministers and a young white man, none of whom I knew, were there too. I said goodbye to Mother, hopped out of the car, and made my way over to the group. As I walked toward them, I saw Ernie, Gloria, and another student I recognized, Jefferson Thomas, a fellow sophomore who had been president of the student council at Dunbar the previous year. I had worked closely with him as vice president, so I knew him pretty well. There were 3 other students I didn't know, but I learned their names pretty quickly. Thelma Mothershed, Minnie Jean Brown, and Jane Hill, a tall, quiet girl who seemed a bit more uncomfortable than the rest. We chatted anxiously until one of the ministers approached and said it was time to get moving. But first, he said, we needed to pray. We formed a tight circle and bowed our heads as the Reverend asked God to walk with us, strengthen and protect us. Then the adults put us in formation. Out front were the 4 white men: Reverend Dunbar Ogden, Jr., president of the Greater Little Rock Ministerial Association, his 21-year-old son, David, Reverend Will Campbell of the Nashville-based National Council of Churches, and Reverend George Chauncey of First Presbyterian Church in Monticello, a small town in southern Arkansas. The students lined up by 2s in the middle. Reverends Bass and Driver held up the rear. Now it was time to go. Slowly and silently, our group began moving in tandem up Park Street toward the school. I could hear the rumble of a crowd up ahead. It was loud, like a Dunbar football game-sized crowd. I clutched my notebook and moved with the group through the sticky September air. With every step, the hooting and hollering grew louder. As we got closer to 14th Street, I glanced toward the mobile gas station on the other side of the street, and for the first time, I saw it. A mob of people that stretched as far as I could see. The sheer size of the crowd was shocking. There must have been hundreds of people. White mothers with faces contorted in anger. White fathers pumping their fists in the air and shouting. White teenagers and children waving Confederate flags and mimicking their parents. Just who were these people? Were they the women who turned up their noses and murmured nasty words at Mother and me on the city bus? Were they the white customers I saw from time to time with Big Daddy at the meatpacking houses downtown? Were they my white neighbors? The scene felt surreal. With everyone screaming and jeering at once, their words sounded muddled, except for one. Nigger! 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 It shot out of angry mouths like bullets and pierced my ears again and again. Adrenaline pulsed through my body and quickened the pace of my heart, but I wasn't afraid. The mob was too far away to stop me from getting inside. The front entrance of the school was now in sight, and the military was just steps ahead. I was more perplexed than anything else. I had never seen such raw anger up close before, and this was directed at me. For what? Because I wanted to go to school? I turned away and remembered Mother's and Daddy's words. They're just ignorant, low-class people. They're just trying to scare you. Do not stoop to their level. You are a walls. Just take the next step and the next. Finally, we were staring into the faces of the Arkansas National Guard. The guardsmen had formed a ring around the school. They blocked the entrance, but I was certain that when they saw us, they would just step aside and allow us through. They were, after all, there to protect us and to keep out the troublemakers, I thought. But not one of them budged. Instead, the commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marion Johnson, whose name I was to discover later, stepped forward. Commander Johnson assumed Reverend Ogden was our leader and began addressing him. The rest of us gathered closely around. I stood to the side of Johnson, who had both hands clutched unnaturally tight around a billy club. His knuckles looked white. Ernie, pressing his lips together nervously, stood beside me. That put him almost face to face with the officer. Gloria stood behind me, and behind her, Jane towered over us all. Johnson told Reverend Ogden that on the orders of Faubus, we would not be permitted to enter the school. The commander's words stunned me. There was a huge disconnect in my head. The guardsmen weren't there to protect us. They were there to keep us out. As the message washed over me, I thought, "You've got to be kidding." Ernie, the only senior among us, spoke up. "You're not going to let us in? Is that what you're telling us?" The officer repeated his order for us to leave. His men stood resolutely in formation, still blocking us out, their rifles slung across their chest. Our group stood there for a moment, not quite sure what to do. And then the ministers turned and led us silently away. The mob continued yelling in the distance, but this time I barely heard any of it. I was completely stunned. I'd never missed a day of school in my life. I still could not believe that I was standing just steps from the schoolhouse door, wanting desperately just to go to class, and the powers that be wouldn't let me in. The highest court in the land had said I had a right to be at that school, to learn, just like the white children. What would it take to open those closed ears and change their hardened hearts?
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade.Is. Broadcasting, hopefully, another constructive segment of the Context of White Supremacy. Today's date is Friday, April 5th, 2013, so I have been told. Vacation was very pleasant, but the system of white supremacy continues. The sound clip that you heard at the beginning, the music in the background, Duke Ellington, Black, Brown, and Beige. Excellent stuff. Spent some of my vacation listening to a little bit of Duke. The audio, the vocals, that was from Carlotta Walls-Lanier. She is a black female victim of racism. She is one of the Little Rock Nine. Her autobiography is A Mighty Long Way, My Journey to Justice at Little Rock Central High School. This was published in 2009. Signature work. I was thinking about that over the break. We're going out of turn. The book that we should be doing now should have been selected by listeners. That's the pattern that we've set since we've been doing the book club almost a year now. I'm breaking with pattern because we just did the Melba Patilla Beals, Warriors Don't Cry. I selected that audiobook. It seemed like people were engaged. We had a reasonable amount of participation, and it seemed like people were saying that they were getting constructive information. I think this event, what happened at Central High in Arkansas, I think it is an extremely important event. White people have said so, but they do that. They try to confuse us. So just because they say it's important doesn't necessarily mean it's important. I say, just from what I know of these events, very important. Doesn't matter, if you have concluded that, hey, this was not a good deal for us, having increased contact with white people and going to school with them has not worked out in our best interest. That's outstanding. That's, I think, doing what Mr. Fuller advises. When you look at history, you look for the errors. So we should definitely be looking for that, not to criticize victims, but just looking for ways that racists, white people duped us, confused us, took advantage of our lack of life-saving information about racism, white supremacy, what it is, how it works. So keep that in mind. And again, this is signature work. And when I say that, we spent, I think, 2 months, maybe even a little more than 2 months, 10 weeks doing Melba Patilla Beals work. Now we're going to spend another probably 7 weeks or so doing this particular book, Elizabeth and Hazel. That's a lot of time. You should definitely monitor your time and energy. Make sure you're not wasting it. Just because I say it's constructive doesn't necessarily make it so. So you should definitely be evaluating. And I would say, listen and be extremely suspicious about the information, what's being said. A white person wrote this book. White people have said, hey, this is really important. This is a great moment in Negro history. They got all this footage. They got tons of books and films and documentaries about this. So I would say we should take advantage. I think there's a lot that can be learned from what happened with these events. There's so many different perspectives. Really, I think should be very nutritious for our brain computer. With that, quick nuggets that I'll share from the audio we heard, and then we'll get started with this week's program. From the segment, Carlotta Walls Lanier, she used the words stunned, stung, being in disbelief. She had a mental disconnect. You gotta be kidding. Real seems like she had a real inability to accept truth about white people practicing racism, white supremacy against her, and the maximums they would go to enforce their particular way of practicing racism, white supremacy. I think that's a common trend. I think we heard that in Melba Patilla Beals, and it'll be interesting to see if that plays out in our new book for this week. Not going to spend a lot of time. I want to get right to the audio material. Bill Clinton, some of the same characters are going to pop up. This book does not just stay on the 1957-1958 school year. It gives you the whole arc of these two women's lives, two females' lives, Elizabeth Eckford and Hazel. I want to make sure I give it Hazel Massery, the racist white supremacist who was photographed yelling at Elizabeth Eckford. Gives you their whole life arc, a lot more detail. It's very thorough. It was suggested by one of our listeners, and I think you all will enjoy it. If you don't, if you think it's a waste of time, if it's not of any benefit, hey, let me know. I've already said you all can pick the next two books if you do not see the constructive value, and that should be pointed out if I'm wasting time, if this is not anything of great detail. At any rate, we will get to it. This book, really looking forward to it. The author, David Margolick. Racist suspect, white man, David Margolick. And the title of the book, Elizabeth and Hazel, Two Women of Little Rock, published in 2011. Much more recent than the previous book that we did. We'll do the first audio segment. Once it's done, we'll hit the phone lines. We'll be good to hear from everybody after our 1 week hiatus. Context of White Supremacy, Elizabeth and Hazel.
This is Audible.
Elizabeth and Hazel, Two Women of Little Rock, by David Margolick. Narrated by Carrington McDuffie. Copyright 2011 by Yale University. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Yale University Press and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. To my mother, Gertrude Margolick, with love and gratitude. My interest in any man is objectively in his manhood and subjectively in my own manhood. Frederick Douglass. Prologue. Two Dresses. Early in the morning of September 4th, 1957, two girls in Little Rock, Arkansas, each 15 years old, dressed for school. On a block of black families nestled in the west side of town, in the small brick house she shared with her parents and 5 brothers and sisters, Elizabeth Eckford put on a skirt that her older sister Anna and she had made just for this day. The immaculate white cotton piqué felt cool and soft to the touch. When Elizabeth and Anna, who had labored over it for several weeks, had run out of fabric, they'd trimmed the deep hem with navy blue and white gingham. The new skirt's double rows of gathers made it seem to have tiny pleats, and it appeared especially crisp because Elizabeth had ironed it one last time the night before. Buoyed by the petticoat she wore underneath, it encircled her tiny waist like a bell, one that rang out the tidings of new beginnings. Fashionable and yet modest, descending well below her knees, the pretty skirt was complemented by the rest of what she had chosen to wear that morning: the plain white blouse, which she'd also made, the loafers, the bobby socks. She could just as easily have been going to church, and in a way she was, because for Elizabeth, learning was much more meaningful and useful than prayer. A few miles away, in a house much like Elizabeth's, but in a neighborhood that was all white, Hazel Bryan selected something very different. It was a sleek dress of cool mint green, with a triangular white sash at the top pointing suggestively to her bosom, and a ribbon tied provocatively around her midriff. She'd bought it a few months earlier at one of the classy department stores downtown, maybe Blass or Pfeiffer's, with around 10 of the scarce dollars her mother earned making light bulbs at Westinghouse. Hazel wasn't signaling the start of an earnest new undertaking so much as making a fashion statement. Taking her cues from Marilyn Monroe, Jane Mansfield, Elizabeth Taylor, and the other movie stars she followed, Hazel hoped to show off her petite figure, to look older and more sophisticated and maybe more promiscuous than she really was. She wanted to impress her girlfriends, but with any luck, the boys forever hovering around her would notice too. That the dress was a mite too tight would help. She'd worn the dress before, probably earlier in the summer. Then again, for Hazel, this day wasn't quite as special as it was for Elizabeth. Like all of the white kids, she'd begun school the day before, unperturbed by the soldiers who encircled it, and she had been at this particular school for a year already. 2 girls, one black, one white, born less than 4 months apart, each about to begin 11th grade. Within a few minutes of each other, they set out for the same destination, Little Rock Central High School. They did not know, nor, in the world of the South in the 1950s, would they have ever encountered each other before, except perhaps when they rode the same buses, or passed on a downtown street, or sat, on different levels, in a local movie theater. But within an hour or so they would, and from that moment on, their lives would be inextricably intertwined. For long after that, as long in fact as the tortured saga of relations between the races in the United States and everywhere else still mattered, or as long, when it came right down to it, as people can see, they would be linked. When Hazel got home that afternoon, she took off the dress and changed into something more comfortable, boys' jeans perhaps, they didn't yet make them for girls, and hung it up for the next time. Doubtless there would be many next times, dances, dates, more school days, to put it on. But when Elizabeth removed her skirt that night, then folded it up and handed it to her mother, she already knew she would never wear it or even want to see it again. As everyone else was coming to recognize it, for a time that simple cotton skirt was just about the most famous piece of clothing in the world, Elizabeth set out to forget about it. It promptly went into the attic, and no one, Elizabeth included, ever laid eyes on it again. Chapter 1. Elizabeth Eckford's house sat on a short stretch of West 18th Street, just off Peyton. Everything about the building and the land it rested on was compact, as if someone had sat down and figured out the smallest and most inexpensive way to fulfill a dream, a place of one's own. The home was squat and square, with 2 bedrooms on a single floor, along with a crawl space below and a small attic, accessible only via a ladder. The place was rudimentary, unfinished. The pine floors, for instance, had never been varnished. The front yard was tidy and tiny. There was room for a small garden or a lawn, but not really enough for both, and certainly not enough for a tree. No one had ever bothered with the backyard, where a big rock stuck out of the dirt. A local black doctor, who'd grown rich performing abortions and speculating in real estate, had built it in the late 1940s, and the Eckfords, Elizabeth's parents, Oscar Jr., and Bertie, her older sister Anna, and her younger brothers, Oscar III and Bolden, were the first folks ever to live there, moving in on Elizabeth's 8th birthday in October 1949. That was a time, shortly after World War II, when if you scrambled enough, even the relatively poor could own their own homes. The house had grown with the family, As two more children, Melbert Dawn and Catherine, had come along, the Eckfords had added a couple of rooms to the back. Little Rock in the Eisenhower era was a racial checkerboard, with blocks of whites and blocks of blacks interspersed throughout large parts of the city. To delineate the racial boundaries, one needed only to look up — there were no streetlights in the black neighborhoods — or down. The white blocks were paved, while the black ones were clay, though they were always covered with oil — it tamped down the dust — whenever elections loomed. Elizabeth's mother had always hated the neighborhood. She'd grown up in the sticks, in the hamlet of Pettis, Arkansas, 35 miles or so east of Little Rock. Her education there was spotty, scheduled around the crop year. Like promising and ambitious blacks throughout the state, she'd come to Little Rock by herself as a teenager to attend the prestigious all-black Dunbar High School, earning her keep by cleaning the home of the black schoolteacher with whom she lived. The schoolteacher had evidently taken on the country girl as her personal project, refurbishing her language and cleaning up her grammar. Bertie became a stickler herself, correcting her children whenever they split infinitives. She never liked the home on West 18th Street, with many lots either still wooded or empty. A cow grazed on one. The area reminded her of the countryside she had fled. Once a year, Elizabeth would visit her blind grandfather in Pettis. His farm had a mule, and the water tasted different there. Near the city limits, Elizabeth's new neighborhood also housed various illicit businesses. Sundays, the kids watched gleefully as ladies in their church finery tiptoed toward the nearby gin mills to gamble or drink. Within Little Rock's black community, the Eckfords were known for their intelligence and seriousness. They'd always thought of themselves as something special, or, as Bertie Eckford once put it, something on a stick. "Aren't you Eckfords?" someone once asked Elizabeth's brother Bolden when he stumbled into a bootlegging joint. "Don't tell your parents you were down here." The patriarch of the family was Elizabeth's grandfather, Oscar Eckford Sr., a large and imperious man. His second wife, Elizabeth's step-grandmother, and even some white people called him Mr. Eckford, who ran a small grocery store and cafe called Eckford's Confectionery on West 15th Street. He had served in France in World War I. When the state VFW wouldn't admit him and other blacks, he had helped set up a VFW post of their own, and started his store during the Depression, selling the ribs his wife cooked up in the front room of their house. Though the shelves were never very full, there were big jars of barbecue sauce, made from vinegar, root beer, brown sugar, and mustard, along with enormous bags of cornmeal and flour and lots of penny candies. The place smelled of double bubble gum. From behind the counter, sitting with his fat legs crossed, Oscar Eckford presided over his domain, barking out orders to his wife and everyone else. Her grandfather was the only black man Elizabeth knew who spoke to white people without fear, in part, she figured, because he paid his bills on time and never owed anybody anything. He was very principled, with little patience for people who, like the white man who delivered bread to his store, refused to take a stand on the issues of the day. Such a fellow wasn't worth the gunpowder it would take to blow him up, he liked to say, and that was typical, for he often spoke in aphorisms. He had blue eyes and traced the family name back to a chaplain in the Confederate Army. He was acutely aware of lineage. "Who are your people?" he regularly asked. Of all his grandchildren, Elizabeth was, if not necessarily his favorite, the one for whom he held the highest hopes. "Elizabeth," he would always ask, looking her squarely in the eye, "what did you learn in school today?" From Pop-Paw, as his grandchildren called him, she always understood she would go to college, though she never knew quite how. Elizabeth's father was neither as ambitious nor as accomplished, though he surely put in his time. He worked 9 days a week, he told people. 7 were for the Missouri Pacific Railroad, where, after a few unhappy years waiting tables in dining cars, he'd taken a lower-paying job, stocking trains, renting pillows, that let him stay in town. Weekends, he was an extra man, hauling junk in his pickup, performing odd jobs for 3 white families. Bertie Eckford also worked, teaching laundering at the Arkansas School for the Blind and Deaf Negro, 5 blocks from the Eckford home. That let her look after Oscar III, who was badly handicapped. He appeared autistic. The term used then was retarded. Elizabeth's father once described him as an idiot. Late in her life, Bertie disclosed that he'd been dropped during delivery when she'd given birth by herself. Baby brother could have lived at the school, but Bertie brought him home every night. He was a familiar sight in the neighborhood, running up and down the street or rocking back and forth on the porch. Bertie watched her other children just as vigilantly. She let them do very little, like dance or ride a bike or roller skate. Birthday parties were generally forbidden, unless she knew the parents. The Queen of No, Elizabeth called her. When her girls met with their brownie troop a few blocks from home, Bertie knew exactly how long the sessions lasted and how many steps away they were. When they attended shows at the segregated Gem Theater, where there were films with black casts and the audience talked back to the screen, a teenage girl to whom the family was close always went along. When any of them strayed even slightly from her orbit, Bertie Eckford suffered. Whenever one was in trouble or in pain, she somehow always knew. The Eckfords had no phone, it was too costly, but they did have a television, the better for her to keep her children in her sights. When Elizabeth returned from some event, her mother always asked whether there had been any men there. Perhaps, Elizabeth later theorized, she had been sexually molested when she was young. Elizabeth's mother was pious. You could tell her mood by whether she sang hymns or the blues. Once she took voice lessons, which she paid for by letting her teacher use the converted player piano the Eckfords owned to teach other children. She was also superstitious, and mixed in with her Methodism was some sort of hoodoo. She thought certain people, she called them readers, were endowed with supernatural powers, and paid them for their prophecies. One of them lived in a dilapidated house. If she had such magical powers, Elizabeth used to wonder, why had she remained so poor? But her superstition was ecumenical. She spent time in the Baptist bookstore and often clutched a rosary. To some, she seemed a little off, an elevator that didn't go up all the way, as one of Elizabeth's childhood friends put it. Elizabeth's parents had a troubled marriage. Her father was abusive and strayed regularly, though it was something Elizabeth knew only from her mother's complaints. Perhaps that was why the Eckfords ignored certain family rituals. For instance, never did they sit for a family portrait. Only in some years could Elizabeth afford to buy her school picture. Early on, Elizabeth became a reader. When, at age 7, she finished her first book, Dr. Seuss's The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins, she felt like shouting with joy. A whole world had just opened up to her. In 6th grade, she overheard a teacher saying she read at an 11th grade level. Sensing this, Elizabeth's parents let her sit in her daddy's chair and read, even while her siblings had to clean the house. When you saw her, 9 times out of 10 she had her head buried in a book. The kids in her neighborhood thought of her as the professor girl. Whenever they had a question about something, they turned to her. But Elizabeth was modest. She got good grades not because she was smart, she thought, but because it was expected of her, and because she worked hard, and, at least in 9th grade civics, because she had a crush on her teacher. Chapter 2. There was one other thing everyone noticed about Elizabeth, or at least she thought they did. Her smile was crooked. The Crumpton twins had welcomed her into her new neighborhood by throwing rocks at her and calling her buck teeth. White children, she knew from the sitcoms on television, could fix their teeth with braces, but that wasn't an option for her. She didn't like looking at herself in the mirror, and sometimes covered her mouth when she spoke. It made her even shyer than she naturally was. Though her mother let her join the pep team in 9th grade, Elizabeth was essentially a loner. Classmates knew they'd never see her at dances or socials. Their parents were strict too, but they, unlike Elizabeth, had learned how to get around the rules. To them, Elizabeth was eccentric, a homebody, a square. Her first date Anna had to arrange for her, picking the boy and helping make her dress. When she was comfortable with someone, like Minnie Jean Brown, who was in her class and lived for a time next door, she could be clever and wickedly funny. More often, people couldn't coax full sentences from her, and even when they could, they sometimes couldn't hear the end. Elizabeth would raise her hand in class, and then, once all eyes were on her, wonder why on earth she had. Though she'd occasionally blow her bus money on doughnuts, she was slight. No one had yet diagnosed her as depressed, but it ran in her family. The Eckfords regularly attended the Allen Temple African Methodist Episcopal Church, 9 blocks from their home. Elizabeth welcomed the diversion. It was one of her only avenues out of the house, and when the children went by themselves, a chance to get away from her mother. But religion provided her little comfort. It all seemed very illogical to her. "You'll get over that," her mother had cockily predicted, but she never really had. For hours at a time she'd daydream on the big rock in her backyard, pretending she was sitting by a campfire somewhere far away, realizing that wherever she found herself, she didn't quite belong. And yet, much to the amazement of those who knew her, in the fall of 1957, Elizabeth was among the 9 black students who had enlisted, then been selected, to enter Little Rock Central High School. Central was the first high school in a major southern city set to be desegregated since the United States Supreme Court had ruled 3 years earlier in Brown v. Board of Education that separate and ostensibly equal education was unconstitutional. Inspired both by Thurgood Marshall, who had argued Brown, and Clarence Darrow — she'd watched the Spencer Tracy version of him in Inherit the Wind — Elizabeth wanted to become a lawyer, and she thought Central would help her realize that dream. She knew that in the Jim Crow South, the best of everything went to the white schools, and Central was far and away the best high school in Arkansas. Even more miraculously still, her overprotective mother had gone along with her decision. For months, in a campaign of growing vituperation, white groups had mobilized to keep the black students out of Central. 3 nights earlier, the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, had announced that to maintain peace and order when the school opened, he was surrounding it with members of the state's National Guard. To Elizabeth, that was reassuring. Soldiers would be there to protect her. Besides, there would be some familiar faces on hand, not just a few of the other black students, like Minnie Jean, but some white children for whose parents her mother had worked or who lived nearby. Elizabeth had had scant exposure to white people and knew too little about them even to be scared. Most worrisome to her was having to find her way around the place. Central was enormous, far larger than any of the black schools she'd attended. But on that first morning of school, her primary concern was looking nice. Her mother had done her hair the night before, an elaborate 2-hour ritual, with a hot iron and a hotter stove, of straightening and curling. Then there were her clothes. People in Black Little Rock knew that the Eckford girls were expert seamstresses. Practically everything they wore they made themselves, and not from the basic patterns of McCall's, but from the more complicated ones in vogue. It was a practice born of tradition, pride, and necessity. Homemade was cheaper, and it spared black children the humiliation of having to ask to try things on in the segregated department stores downtown. Huddled over the pedal-operated singer in their living room, the largest open space in their crowded home, the Eckford girls made themselves outfits for Christmas, Easter, and always the beginning of school. Calm as Elizabeth was that morning, her mother was her usual apprehensive self. The night before, she'd urged Elizabeth to turn to her Bible, and Elizabeth had picked the 4th Psalm. "Answer when I call, my saving God. In my troubles you cleared a way." On the television, as Elizabeth ate her breakfast, a newsman described large crowds gathering around Central. It was all Bertie needed to hear. "Turn that thing off," she shouted from the kitchen. Should anyone say something nasty at her, she counseled Elizabeth, pretend not to hear them, or better yet, be nice and put them to shame. Elizabeth's father, who worked nights and would normally have been asleep, was up and agitated too, even though the police chief had personally assured him there'd be no trouble. He paced the room, holding his pipe, chomping on an unlit cigar. After making sure everyone looked right, and that they all had their pencils and notebooks and lunch money, Bertie Eckford gathered her children around her in the living room. Then, together, they recited the 27th Psalm. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. Though a host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this will I be confident." She instructed Elizabeth to say it to herself over and over again at the school. If she did just that, her mother said, she had nothing to fear. Around 7:30, Elizabeth, carrying a green notebook, left the house with Anna, 1 year older than she, who had elected to stay at Horace Mann, the black high school to which Elizabeth had gone the previous year. The day was bright and sunny, still more summer than fall, and Elizabeth put on her sunglasses, dark orbs in a clear plastic frame that were a little too big for her face. Her eyes were extremely sensitive to light. Together, she and Anna walked to 16th and Peyton, only 2 blocks away but already into a white neighborhood with concrete streets, and boarded the War Memorial bus. For a few years now, Elizabeth had been able to sit wherever she wanted, but the old folk ways persisted. Whether out of habit or fear, older blacks still clustered toward the rear, while mischievous black children planted themselves alongside elderly white women, who, much to their delight, would leap up as if nudged with red-hot pokers. The ride to Central cost 25 cents and took only about 15 minutes. Little Rock was little. Very different worlds were very close together. The bus went down to Lewis, then took a left to 13th, where it headed east through a white working-class neighborhood. At South Pine was the all-white Robert E. Lee Elementary School, and across the street, the Lee Theater, where Elizabeth sometimes watched movies, though only from the balcony. On the bridge over the Missouri Pacific tracks just beyond Woodrow, she felt her first fears. She was approaching Central. The football stadium was visible to her right. She got off at Denison, then walked up to Park, where she turned. Up the hill, on Park and 14th, was a mobile station. Beyond that, on the other side of the street, and stretching for 2 blocks, lay Central. Instantly, she sensed something amiss. There were more parked cars than usual, and she heard the muffled murmur of a crowd. Then the military jeeps and half-tracks came into view, and then the soldiers. To Benjamin Fine of the New York Times, who had been there since 4:30 that morning, the crowd had at first seemed cheerful, even festive. If anyone had a popcorn concession, they could have had a picnic, he later recalled. Some of the white girls flirted with the National Guardsmen, many of them scarcely older than they, some Central graduates themselves. A few boys waved Confederate flags. A man played Dixie on his cornet. But not everything was so upbeat. "They don't want to be in your school, they want to be in your bedroom," a minister shouted through a bullhorn. Standing shoulder to shoulder, the ragtag group of soldiers encircled the school. Across the street, bystanders gathered. A young newsman with NBC, John Chancellor, counted 92 of them by around the time Elizabeth left home. Suddenly, a commotion. "They're coming!" someone shouted. "The niggers are coming!" The "they" was really just a she. Elizabeth, a black face and a cloud-like splotch of white in the bronzed late-summer streetscape, was approaching. Shortly, the world would learn all about the Little Rock Nine. At this moment, she was the Little Rock One. Chapter 3. In 1927, Little Rock witnessed two seemingly contradictory events, occurring only a few miles apart. Together, they help illustrate how, even 30 years later, the city could be a place of both lofty aspirations and deep-seated intolerance. The paradox was, in fact, nothing new. Little Rock was also where, in 1889, Frederick Douglass was welcomed by the state legislature, but turned away by a local restaurant. In May 1927, a 35-year-old black man named John Carter, the married father of 5, fled into the woods after supposedly assaulting a white woman and her daughter on the road to Hot Springs. A search party tracked him down, and before long a lynch mob had gathered around him. The men tied together a rope and chain, placing one end atop a telephone pole and the other around Carter's neck, before forcing him to climb onto the hood of a Ford Roadster. "Start praying, nigger, because you are getting ready to go," someone shouted. Strictly as a matter of visual dramatics, this lynching was a bust. When the car pulled away, Carter dangled only 5 feet off the ground, but it sufficed. He hung there for 2 minutes, just long enough to die. Then 50 men riddled him with some 200 bullets. The corpse was tied to a rear bumper, and a procession of 30 or 40 cars, filled with howling men and boys, made its way into Little Rock, passing undisturbed by the police station and courthouse en route. After driving around for an hour, the mob placed the body on the trolley tracks at West 9th Street and Broadway, in the heart of the black part of town, then doused it with gasoline. 4,000 or 5,000 people, including women with babies, converged on the scene, and for the next 3 hours or so, they celebrated around the blaze. Whenever the fire died down, more gasoline, along with boxes, doors, windows, and furniture, some of it lifted from nearby black homes and a black church, brought it back to life. The police stood by. The mayor showed up only after Carter was but a charred crust. His bones became prized souvenirs. Little Rock's blacks, who had huddled in terror as the events unfolded, slowly emerged from their homes and businesses as the furor died down. Those who had stuck around, that is. Elizabeth's grandfather had hidden his children under a bed, then spirited them via the Rock Island line to Forest City, 95 miles to the east. Afterward, from the relative safety of the North, the black press recapitulated what had happened. To the crowd, the Chicago Defender related, Carter's culpability hadn't really mattered. All they wanted was to see human blood, hear human cries for mercy, smell human flesh as it burned itself out. They wanted their children to grow up with the memory of a human being hanging from a tree, his head almost shot away, blood streaming from 100 holes in his body. When it was all over, the Defender reporter wrote, "The crowd, tired from its exertions, hungry but happy, dispersed. Some went back to their businesses, some returned to their pulpits, some to finish their housework, and the children to their classrooms. It was a perfectly gorgeous affair, and everyone was happy. That is a picture of Arkansas." Over the next few weeks, the Missouri Pacific sold record numbers of tickets to blacks fleeing Little Rock. The lynching, the city's first in 36 years, horrified respectable whites. A saturnalia of savagery, the Arkansas Gazette called it, but only to a point. No one involved was ever prosecuted. nor was any official ever removed from office, though both the Defender and another leading black weekly, the Pittsburgh Courier, were soon banned from Little Rock because, in the words of the local censorship board, they agitated the state of mind of the colored populace of the city. In the next 30 years, nothing remotely similar had happened. But how many eyewitnesses, including all those children who'd either looked on or cowered in corners, remained part of Little Rock circa 1957? How quickly or completely could such hatred and fear ever dissipate? How much, in fact, would it only have been stoked as blacks, however tentatively, began pressing for their rights, including the right to have their children attend the same schools as whites? The glow from the funeral pyre that night surely illuminated the glorious new home for Little Rock High School, the central part came much later, that was rising only a few miles away, on Park between 14th and 16th Streets. A Gothic structure of buff-colored brick enveloping 2 full city blocks, it was monumental, stately, self-confident, emanating what the Arkansas Democrat called an almost ancient cathedral permanence. Clearly it was too big and grandiose for its present purposes, but the city fathers were thinking epic thoughts. One day, and soon, it all but shouted, progressive, forward-thinking Little Rock would grow into it. In a region so wedded to and crippled by its past, here was a building that looked resolutely forward. Helping to make Little Rock famous, the Little Rock Gas and Fuel Company said of the school in an advertisement that ran when the building formally opened that November, and this turned out to be prophetic. It would prove an ideal backdrop to epical events. 5,000 people, presumably a very different 5,000 from those who'd gathered around the trolley tracks at 9th and Broadway a few months earlier, attended the dedication. The day's speeches abounded with those superlatives Americans so love. The biggest this, the most expensive that. One even graced the new letterhead, the most beautiful high school in America. Another could have said, the most archetypal. Could there ever have been a high school that looked, well, so much like a high school? Most striking were the 4 stone sentinels above its monumental entryway, each symbolizing one of the values to be imparted inside: ambition, personality, opportunity, and preparation. Another of Central's tenets went unrepresented, though it, too, could have been depicted in stone, perhaps by a figure with its hands held up, palms out: exclusion. Little Rock's new high school was, naturally, for whites only. Built like a fortress, for the next 3 decades it proved impregnable to Little Rock's black children. For them, its manicured grounds might just as well have been a moat. When Central was built, blacks in Little Rock had their own primitive, ramshackle school. Another few years would pass before Dunbar High School, largely funded, as were thousands of schools for blacks throughout the South by the Jewish philanthropist Julius Rosenwald, would open. It was designed by the same local architects who'd done Central, and standing only a few blocks away, was modeled consciously, almost poignantly, after it. Not surprisingly, it was far smaller and less sumptuous, with fewer classes to take, fewer frogs to dissect, fewer fields to play on. Its textbooks were hand-me-downs from Central, bequeathed after many years' use, sometimes arriving, the white students knew where they were destined, with racial epithets on their pages. But Dunbar, too, was considered the best of its kind, the most modern and complete public high school building in the United States erected specifically for Negroes, as a Works Progress Administration guide put it. The dream of the colored people of Little Rock has come true, far beyond in beauty, modernity, and size what the boldest had ever hoped for, the local black paper declared when it opened. Of all the states in the old Confederacy, Arkansas was probably, on racial matters, the most enlightened. In the ferment following World War II, several graduate departments of the University of Arkansas admitted black students. When Silas Hunt entered its law school in 1948, He was said to have been the first black student at any state university in the old Confederacy since Reconstruction. A handful of smaller towns peacefully integrated their schools following the Brown decision. Fayetteville so decided within a week of the ruling. It was part the relative open-mindedness of a college town, part economic necessity. Without a black high school of its own, the cash-strapped city had spent $5,000 the previous year to put up the 9 black students it shipped off to segregated schools in Fort Smith and Hot Springs, 50 and 200 miles away. Faubus had been elected governor in 1954 as a racial moderate, someone who idolized Lincoln and, he liked to boast, would have backed the Union during the Civil War. Little Rock, population 100,000 at the time, was one of the most progressive cities in the region. Things had settled down since the lynching, in part because blacks had resumed their traditional places. Accustomed since birth to characteristically Southern environmental factors, the Negroes of Little Rock and North Little Rock accept them with little outward evidence of resentment, stated a WPA report from 1941. By the mid-1950s, though, blacks could use some parks, and on certain days, the zoo. Some of the whites-only and colored signs had been removed from drinking fountains. Thanks to court cases and protests, black school teachers earned as much as whites. Black policemen patrolled 9th Street. In 1954, the year before Martin Luther King Jr. led his famous boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, Little Rock quietly desegregated its buses. So when Elizabeth's mother set off to clean the houses of wealthy white families in Pulaski Heights, she could sit wherever she pleased. The handful of white professors at the local black college, Philander Smith, could eat at the strictly colored Charmaine Hotel without being prosecuted, as they would have been in Mississippi. Little Rock boosters noted with pride that white salesmen now waited on black women when they bought shoes. Even the conservative Arkansas Democrat had come to use Miss and Mrs. when writing about black women. With his Land of Lincoln, Illinois license plates, the NBC newsman Sander Van Oker was terrified to enter places like Jackson, Mississippi, or Birmingham, Alabama, but in Little Rock he felt just fine. But beneath this comparatively tolerant facade, Jim Crow was alive and well in Little Rock. Newspaper policy notwithstanding, whites invariably called blacks by their first names. The train and bus stations still had separate waiting rooms, though more now by custom or habit than by stricture, integrated whenever some oblivious outsider stumbled into the forbidden realm. Sometimes a white person drinks from the wrong fountain, discovers his mistake, and ambles away with a sheepish grin, one reporter noted. Blacks could not patronize local soda fountains and coffee shops, or the restaurants in the downtown department stores. The First Lady of the Black Press, Ethel Payne of the Chicago Defender, couldn't find a place to eat, at least in the white part of town, while seated. Like other blacks, she had to order her victuals through the back door. To Payne, who'd traveled all over the segregated South, Little Rock was the crummiest corner on the map. Harold Isaacs of MIT, who came to study race relations in Little Rock in November 1957, learned that there wasn't a single establishment where he could have a cup of coffee with a black man. Were a white man to sit with a black woman in one of the colored establishments on 9th Street, he was told, there would inevitably be trouble, requiring police intervention. No hotel would accommodate Carl Rowan, then a young reporter for the Minneapolis Tribune. Daisy Bates, who besides running the Arkansas NAACP, co-published with her husband L.C. Bates, the weekly black newspaper The State Press, effectively turned her home into a rooming house for visiting black reporters. Their paper barely scraped by, threatened by both black penury and timidity and fickle white patronage. Can you vision what it takes to build up a newspaper in the Deep South, contrary to the white man's wishes and way of thinking, among a bunch of Uncle Toms who do not even know that the Emancipation Proclamation has been signed? L.C. Bates once wrote to an impatient black creditor. For all the rules, written and unwritten, guiding relations between the races, there were dangerous areas of gray. As one local black lawyer, Robert Booker, told Isaacs, sometimes one was lured into them by an ostensibly friendly gesture. Even in her insular and constricted world, Elizabeth had had brushes with Southern racial reality. To get ice cream, and eat it before it melted, she and her family had to go to the colored waiting room of the Little Rock train station. Though the main library was officially integrated, blacks had to read the books somewhere else. She could watch movies only in the segregated Gem Theater or, as in the Lee, from the balconies of a few white theaters. The one time Elizabeth prepared to sit down and eat with the family for whom she did occasional housework, the mother, a Girl Scout troop leader, had quickly found something else for her to do. For a white neighbor, Elizabeth waxed the floors the woman's own daughters refused to do. As payment, she was given 2 old hand-me-down skirts. Because the Eckfords traveled little, Elizabeth had been spared the segregated or non-existent restrooms, restaurants, and hotels she would have encountered on the road. But she came instinctively to recognize the invisible borders of Jim Crow culture. She noticed that white and black children played together easily until around age 10, when the word nigger crept into the white kids' vocabularies. She learned that white people were to be feared. They could hurt you and your parents without cause or cost. She saw that white children were more spontaneous and uninhibited than black children, perhaps because they didn't fear the white man's wrath. She noticed, too, that black children from the North felt freer than children like her. That became painfully apparent with the notorious case of Emmett Till, the young black boy from Chicago who'd been murdered in Mississippi in 1954 after supposedly whistling at a white woman. Till had been barely a year older than Elizabeth. She remembered seeing the famous picture of him in his casket, his body beaten and bloated, that appeared in Ebony. But that was Mississippi, and Mississippi, she believed, was a different world from Arkansas.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. The number again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Really quick before I hit the phone line. Wow. Again, I'm telling listeners, this should be thoroughly scrutinized. Just because Gus says that he thought it was constructive and saying that, it's worth our time and energy, that doesn't make it so. I could be off, so definitely be paying attention. If you think it's a waste of time, forget it. You can let us know, gripe about it along the way, and point out what's not constructive about it. I would just say keep in mind that a racist did write this book, which made it even more informative for me. Super quick, I hope people caught when they mentioned the playing of Dixie by a white man in the crowd. Why that song plays so regularly on the program. I almost included it in the introduction when Carlotta Walls Lanier, I almost included it there as well. It would have been apropos, but I decided against. That was one, and just religion. I put that in all of the descriptions for Warriors Don't Cry, the importance of religion and white Jesus. I didn't do it this time, but it definitely could be there. Just wow, the Psalms. The song I think it was Psalms 23 with Warriors Don't Cry. I might be wrong, but I think it was Psalms 23. This time around we got the 4th Psalms and the 27th Psalms, and if my memory serves, Biggie Smalls had the 27th Psalms. He had that tattooed on his body shortly before he was murdered in California. I'll have to double check, but I'd bet several nickels that it was not just a Psalms, that it was the 27th Psalms specifically. Hitting the phone lines, I think we have B. Moore and our caller at 9325. I will hit other lines as I see hands. I think it's B. Moore and 9325. Your lines should be open.
Peace, can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, peace, Gus, and all the other listeners. I was going to touch on the same things you just mentioned. But yeah, I had the Psalms written down, of course, the whole Dixie thing. This idea of white people just doing what they do, being terrorizers, with them burning the bodies and gathering to watch, and then collecting the bones as souvenirs. Basically, the whole time I was just thinking, what's really changed? Nothing has really changed. Same system, different day. It's just like they have everything on repeat. And then when they were talking about desegregation, and they were talking about all the things that have quote-unquote changed, and it seemed like all the places that they desegregated or what have you were places where non-white black people could spend their money. So it's like, okay, we'll take your money, but you're still a nigger. And, yeah, like I said, same system, different day. That's all I have for now.
They don't necessarily take your money at school, do they? Public school?
It all depends on what it is. I mean, you have to buy uniforms at times. I mean, sometimes you have to pay for your lunch. I mean, I don't know. It just seems like your money. That's what they're for. We'll take your money, but we're going to push you down at school. We're going to throw flaming toilet paper at you. We're going to do all this stuff to you. But you can come and eat, but you have to come through the back door. You can come and spend your money for the same food we're getting, but come through the back door. So, I don't know. Just money came to my mind. Because they were talking about I believe the buses, people could sit where they wanted, and I don't know, just different things. And I was just thinking of the whole money idea.
No, I think it makes sense. I was just playing the non-white adversary just to see if it would hold for school. But I think it's obvious they take things that are worth a lot more than money at school. I think that was demonstrated in the last book. I think it'll be demonstrated in this book as well. I think a lot of us from our own experience can attest to that, what they steal and what they put in you. They don't just take, they give you some things that are not constructive as well. So, yeah, self-evident, I hope. Let's see, 9325, did you want to share, or do you want to wait?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Oh, boy. Greetings, Gus, to the other callers. This book kind of threw me for a loop there in chapter 3. It started out very calm, talking about the two dresses. Melba made hers. Not Melba. Elizabeth and her sister had made her dress. And Hazel had ended up buying hers from an expensive store downtown. So I thought it was, pretty interesting the way he opened up, showing the differences of the environments that the two young ladies was growing up in. I thought it was apropos that he spent a little more time on Elizabeth. She was influenced by religion. Again, although she thought that learning was more important than praying, she was still influenced by that same religious attitude. And it seems like the Psalms is a very popular book in that era. It was mentioned also in Warriors Don't Cry. Different verses, but I think the same type of influence. It was interesting. I tried to include some of Hazel's background in my commentary. It's kind of difficult because he didn't spend that much time with her at first. I think she was influenced by the movie actresses of the time. Started out kind of subtle, giving the background of 6 or 7 people living in a small 2-bedroom house. The girls were close in age, but very different in their environments. I thought it was in the note.
We can hear you now, sir.
Okay, I'm sorry. My phone was disconnected. I may have this problem.
I think it happened to... You weren't the only one. I think it looks like a lot of people got disconnected at the same time.
Okay, I'll try to finish up real quick. This will probably happen again. But I was talking about Birdie, which is Elizabeth's mother. Super confused. She was African Methodist, but she was spending time in a Baptist bookstore, clutching a rosary, which is Catholic. She's superstitious, and she's interested in voodoo and visiting readers. So, if that's not enough confusion for you, she's very pious, and she's strict. She's forever asking Elizabeth whether there were men wherever she was, alluding to the fact that she may have been sexually molested when she was young. Medical disparities jump up in the fact that the mother said she gave birth by herself and dropped the baby boy on his head. And Elizabeth's inability to get her teeth fixed. That's all I have for right now. Thanks for taking the call.
Great point about the confusion on the part of Elizabeth Eckford's mother. A lot of the metaphysics, I've seen how that can cause a lot of confusion, looking for some mystical power to intervene in our lives. Yeah, great point. Great point. The medical disparities, too, we heard that. Seems like that was very similar with what we heard with Melba Patilla Beals at the beginning about she went to the hospital and the racists abused her and she almost died in childbirth. And then we got parallel story here with one of Elizabeth Eckford's siblings being apparently dropped at birth. How racism, white supremacy impacts the health from day one while you're trying to get out of the womb. I had a few notes you all are interested in sharing. Again, the number is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#, *6 if you would like to participate. Number one, I was in error, would have lost a few nickels. Biggie Smalls had the 23rd Psalms tattooed on his arm. 23rd Psalms, which I actually was checking it to see, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That's the 23rd Psalms, which is pretty close. It's probably all running right together because they're doing the 27th Psalms in this book. And I remember, I think it was the 23rd? I'd have to look back at Melba Patilla Beals' work as well, because I think theirs was either the 23rd or the 27th. So seems like the Psalms passages have been very popular for victims of racism, white supremacy over many years now. Let's see. Oh yeah, I thought the point about Elizabeth's mom asking her if there were men present, the sexual abuse. We had that in Melba Patilla Beal's work as well, where she was almost raped. But the sexual abuse, I think that's something I've said I should be saying it more often, how prevalent, what a major problem that has been for us. There should be as many conversations as we're having about male-female problems and difficulties in attempted partnerships. There should be just as many conversations about the sexual trauma that black males, black females, black children are living with, dealing with, attempting to recuperate from. Long-running problem. So glad that was brought out as well. This book has footnotes. I know I have complained before. Greg Kading, he was supposed to be on the program. He was a former LAPD officer, to talk about Biggie Smalls, Tupac Shakur. And I was saying that he writes this book about this serious incidents, and there are no footnotes. This is detailed. You're given different viewpoints and different opinions, and you don't have any evidence. You don't have any footnotes to back up what is being said. This book has footnotes, which makes it pretty interesting for me. I think this book is pretty easy to access if you want to get a paperback or hard copy to kind of read along with while we're going, so you can kind of check some of the footnotes. It does have interesting info. The passage where they were talking about, we had Daisy Bates mentioned, prominent figure in all of this, where they were talking about how difficult it is to run a black paper in this environment. They did do some name calling in the quote, Uncle Tom's, and pretty colorful, some of the dialogue that they get from the black newspaper, so you get some contemporary quotes. But when it goes on and says, for all the rules, written and unwritten, guiding relations between the races, there were dangerous areas of gray. As one local black lawyer, Robert Booker, told Isaacs, sometimes one was lured into them by an ostensibly friendly gesture. And there's a footnote for this. I scroll down, I'm checking out the footnote to see what exactly this incident is about. And this is the anecdote. This is footnote number 7 for chapter 3. It's Booker recalled that once, while he was buying something at the cigar stand in the cafe by the courthouse, some white lawyers sitting at a nearby table invited him over for a soda. He didn't know what to do. Blacks could enter the place, but normally could not sit down. Again, he was asked to join the group. As everyone watched him, he went over and took a seat. He drank his Coke, uncomfortable from first sip to last. Fascinating anecdote, I think, included here in this footnote, and I think it's fitting for the entirety of this event. I think Blacker, when he dialed in last week and was voicing some of his frustrations around, witnessing the confusion amongst victims of racism, where white people will traumatize you, harm you, and set up these situations just so that they can see you be uncomfortable, just so that they can see you respond to them terrorizing you. For their I think that little anecdote about the white lawyer, and these are white lawyers, it's not like these are just what they would call the riffraff, down and out white trash. These are white lawyers, white attorneys. This is what they do in their free time. We'll see if we can make this black person squirm. And I think that this whole sorry episode at Central High, I think that's about what this is. And the torture, I think if we remember the exact terms used in Melba Patilla Beal's book, she said that the white students were getting expert psychological training on the best way to go about abusing these 9 children. So, yeah, I just thought that anecdote was fascinating. I'll stop there. If anybody, any of the other folks have commentary, I think right now we just have B. Moore and our caller at 9325. Did either of you have anything else you wanted to get in?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
One thing I forgot, it shows how important it is that we should speak to our young people about racism. Her grandfather knew about that incident in 1927 about John Carter being lynched and burned. Although Elizabeth visited him every year, he never told her about that. She didn't know anything about white people. She didn't know enough about them to be scared. So the first day, the only thing she was worried about was looking nice. And they mentioned that her mother spent 2 hours straightening her hair. So it just kind of, it's ironic that, she would take so much care. In fact, this was such a very special day, only to go out there and get humiliated and treated like she was something other than a young teen. That's all I have. Thank you.
That is consistent. I would say, unfortunately, that seeming confusion that the children had amongst the Little Rock Nine and not being prepared for the racism, white supremacy that was waiting for them. That's what I thought it was just fascinating hearing the bit from Carlotta Walls Lanier, her autobiography, where she too talks about being stunned, and she had a mental disconnect. She just could not grasp white people. She could not understand what they were doing, their behavior. And I think that's the position that we end up being in consistently. It stands out even more for me that there's such conformity from the different 9 students that I've heard from. I haven't heard from them all, but just reading more and learning more about it, that they're all seeming to be saying the same thing. Nobody had an understanding of white people are extremely dangerous. This is not going to be fun. This is not going to be safe. This is going to be something where I could potentially die at any time. All of us could have died, really. And, it could have been just like what happened to Mr. Carter. Just to me, it seems fascinating that none of them seem to have an accurate understanding of white people at that time. I'll take this moment to make sure I quote Harriet Tubman. I was able to reference her earlier this week. I freed thousands of slaves, and I could have freed thousands more if they had only known they were slaves. Very important, I think, to keep that in mind anytime reading about or thinking about racism, white supremacy. The confusion that seems to be an integral aspect of racism, white supremacy, confusion amongst the victims where we simply do not grasp. We don't have an in-depth understanding. I think Mr. Nero on a previous program, he was saying having a bird's eye view, not just a street level, but having the view from like 20,000 feet above and seeing how this is all playing out. We just don't seem to have that, man, to put all this in the proper perspective. I'm just checking back because it did seem like even in the first, we're only through like chapter 4, we're only through the first 3 chapters. It did seem like it was said repeatedly, though, that even with a little bit Elizabeth knew at that time, she understood that black people were in fear. Like maybe she doesn't understand the depth of that fear or why the fear should be. Maybe she didn't have an in-depth understanding, but it did seem like there was some grasp of white people causing black people fear. Like even the reference about the Uncle Toms in town that made it difficult for the Bates to keep their paper going. And I want to get the exact sentence, but I think that was mentioned as well. Do y'all remember that? Them saying the black people there were afraid of white people?
Yes, I do. It almost had gotten to a point that they could have taken the signs down because black people knew their place, so to speak. They just automatically went to the balcony in the movie theaters, or they seemed like they automatically knew which water fountain to drink out of, or whatever the mores or the particular thing that black people were supposed to do. They would just do it out of habit. And I thought it was interesting that the author would describe any black person that thought about doing anything that was remotely break those unstated rules. He referred to the children sitting beside the elderly white women as mischievous. And when he was describing Mr. Carter's lynching, almost seemed festive. You know, one part of it said it was a perfectly gorgeous affair and everyone was happy. This was a picture of Arkansas. And how about Governor Forbes elected as a racial moderate? That's a joke.
Yeah, it's real interesting hearing this story being told by a white person. I think it, like I said, it really is nutritious for the brain computer. Paying attention to words that he, like you picked up on him using the term mischievous to describe the young child, and the sexual component. That's a cowbell right there. But yeah, the passage where there does seem to be an acknowledgement about the danger that white people represent. This is the very end of chapter 3, where the white author Margolick, he says, because the Eckfords traveled little, Elizabeth had been spared the segregated restrooms, restaurants, and hotels she would have encountered on the road, but she came instinctively, interesting word choice, to recognize the invisible borders of Jim Crow culture. She noticed that white and black children played together easily until around age 10, when the word nigger crept into the white kids' vocabularies. She learned that white people were to be feared. They could hurt you and your parents without cause or cost. Just that right there is huge. Like, that I think has been lost in the last 50 years. And even with that, seemingly, even that underestimated the damage that white people can inflict in short order without cost or cause. Very important that even with that understanding, it was still didn't really grasp the full nature of the threat that white people represent. Double check. We have about probably 15 minutes before I begin the second audio clip. We have another 15 if you think you want to participate. Again, I think very important text in terms of bringing in powerful white people, the president, the governor, Governor Forbes, the caller just mentioned, the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. Lots of important folks participate in this whole spectacle. Compare and contrast. Be thinking we spent all that time on Melba Patilla Beal's Warriors Don't Cry. Keeping that in mind as we're listening to this. Differences, similarities. That book is going to be mentioned. As I said, this book was written some years after that was published, so it'll be mentioned specifically later on. Just stay alert. Let's see. Yeah, I also thought the lynching scene, when he describes it, when he says strictly as a matter of visual dramatics, this lynching was a bust. I'll stop right there, but he goes on to talk about how the body's not very far off the ground and all of it. Even that, to me, is fascinating for a white person to be talking about. Aesthetically, this wasn't that good of a lynch. A little bit disappointing. They didn't really get the nigger that high off the ground. The elevation was a little poor on this one. Like, that just seems, wow. Only the mind of racist man, racist woman, racist child could frame and talk about a lynching in that manner, where a black male was hung, shot, burned, celebrated, and they cart away his remains as souvenirs. I'm sure a castration was in there as well. But for all of this to happen and for it to be regarded as a bust, didn't quite measure up to standard. That phenomenal illustration of white pathology, in my opinion. checking out a few other passages. I remember and this is just for clarity, I'm remembering when Melba Patilla Beale's book started out, she didn't include the anecdote of the last lynching, although they did mention the fact that there hadn't been a lynching in the town in 30 years. So I'm assuming this is the incident they were referring to, but you never can tell. Kill a lot of black people, still do. Just, I think the layers, when you're talking about racism, white supremacy, I remember with Warriors Don't Cry, there were lots of anecdotes. Like she talks about how she almost died in the hospital. The doctors, the white racist doctors, had such disregard for her life then. And she talks about the incident where she's almost raped when she's trying to get home from school and the house being shot. And I feel like there were so many incidents of terrorism before we even got to the school that it was just wow. Like it already felt like such a tense story just hearing about the daily incidents of racism, white supremacy, even before all this brouhaha about the school incident. And we got the same thing here with a different effect, though, focusing on black people from 30 years ago, totally disconnected from what happened at Central High. But just this is the ins and out of racism, white supremacy. It's probably thousands of these sort of stories that were never recorded, that we'll never even know about. Incidents of just maybe the black person wasn't killed, maybe they weren't raped, but just being terrorized all the same. And, we'll never even hear about it. Just the depth, as I said before, it's a lot I think that can be learned from studying this. And it's not that long ago. If we're talking about history, this is not ancient stuff, just picking out patterns, errors, lessons that can be learned.
Gus, I have a quick question. Just thinking about Elizabeth's psyche at this time with her attempted family. I mean, there was a mother, father. She had siblings. But they talked briefly about the father straying. I was just wondering, but, because Elizabeth said that she had no evidence of this, only about her mother complaining, that maybe it could have been possible that maybe the father wasn't straying, and that could have been in her mind. I mean, if the guy it looks like, they said he worked 9 days a week. He had 3 jobs. I mean, where's all this time that he had to be straying? Is it possible that could have been conjured up in Miss Birdie's mind? What do you think?
Good point. Checking back here. I'm scrolling back to check out that anecdote because I thought that was pretty funny as well. I like having the suspicion there with this book, like I said, written by a white person. So I think just being crucial, skeptical of how things are presented, particularly the sexual aspect. I think it's been a lot of that already, and that tends to fit the racist stereotype of black males being oversexed. Do you have the page where that anecdote is, where he's saying that he works 7 days, where he works 9 days a week, excuse me?
Okay, let's see. It was pretty close to the front of the book.
Okay. Let's see.
Okay. Page 19.
Page 19. Okay. Is it top of the page, bottom of the page?
The bottom. Elizabeth's father was neither as ambitious nor accomplished as his father. You see that?
Looks like my pages are a little off, but I'll find it. Give me a second, I'll find it. Okay.
He worked 9 days a week.
Wow. Yeah, just hearing it. I'm not sure. It does. I mean, it doesn't really give more evidence about him, quote unquote, straying. If he is working all these hours and then given all of the added stress of the quote unquote school integration, that is a valid point. If he would even have had time to step out, maybe that was just suspicion. Maybe that was just something conjured up. Maybe they didn't even say all that because he didn't quote. I want to see if that's in quotes, him straying, or if that's just the way that he decided to word things. It could have been him taking something out of context or whatever the case may be. I want to see how it's worded.
Well, you remember the part where they were describing her grandfather and how he used the acronyms about blowing someone up, and they described him as having blue eyes, tracing his family name back to a chaplain in the Confederate Army. In that area, further on down, it describes Elizabeth's father.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm looking at it right now. This is pretty early on in the book, but yeah, it doesn't have the word strayed is not in quotes, so it may not have even been that Elizabeth used these words, or however he got this information. It may not have been that she even used that term, so it could have been that this is just his interpretation of how things were presented. So yeah, it could have been maybe he wasn't stepping out at all. Maybe he was working and doing his thing and working 9 days a week, just as they said he would. But again, the partnerships, it wouldn't surprise me either way. The partnerships under racism and white supremacy are going to be difficult, to say the least, as long as these conditions persist. Yeah, that part about the grandfather as well, and them saying his lineage had been traced to a white chaplain from the Civil War, and that he had blue eyes, that stood out as well. Yeah.
It makes you wonder, where does he get all this information?
Good point. Some of that is explained towards the end of the book, the last chapter, which is something I think should also be thought about. A white man at that, getting access to read this book. Now, certainly anybody, you can go and just do the research and write a book. That could be done and has been done. But being able to actually go and access, if you're writing a book about people's experience and then you're able to get access to that person, to go and get them to talk to you and maybe reveal documents that you've saved up or any additional resources that you have in your personal possession, to think about that. It seems that, I mean, it's self-evident. White people have been very skilled, very proficient at being able to do this. Go and suck information out of us and write stories and make a lot of money. Amy Willentz, we just had her on the program. Very skilled at doing this all over the world. Again, he is going to explain at the end of the book, I think it's like the last chapter, he explains the process of how he came about writing this book and getting access to Elizabeth Eckford and Hazel, the white woman. That does come up later, but I think that's something we should be thinking about regularly as we move through the book.
Since no one else is sharing, I did a little, I'd say a survey. I told a few people a little something about the book, and I posed a question and asked them if they thought that it would be significant for a white woman to come up in and apologize after a certain period of time for what she had done some 40, 50 years prior to that. And most of the response I got was, it seemed like it's a too little, too late. I don't want to get too. I don't know what happens in the book, but I was wondering how it's going to pan out because, it does seem to be a little, too late for apologies at this point.
That is a major theme of the book, quote-unquote reconciliation. Chapters will be spent on that down the road. It is fascinating. That's why I said this should be a great meal for the brain computer. Lots of data to mull over and think about, different perspectives. And because the writer is white, racist suspect. I would say, if you want a little foreshadowing, the folks out there who have a copy of the book, you can look at the front cover and look at how the photographs are presented. That might give you some foreshadowing as to where things go with this. But just check out the cover. If you don't own the book, that's fine. You can just look online for Elizabeth and Hazel, David Margolick, and just look at images. And I'm pretty sure you'll see what the front cover looks like. It'll tell you a lot.
Gus, could you point out which one of the white women that Hazel, Massery, which one, where is she located in that infamous picture?
If you're looking at the photograph that's on the front of the book, Hazel is the centermost white, or at least in my view, she's the centermost white female. She would be the white woman in the white dress. There is another white woman to her to your left. If you're looking at the picture to your left, there's another white woman. She's in the dark dress. It looks like it's black, maybe, in the dark dress to her, your left. And there's a white man, it looks like, to your right, next to her in the photograph. It looks like she would be the centermost white woman. That's Hazel.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
She's the one that looks most venomous.
Right. They, I think they're going to give some more detail as we roll along about the photograph and the fact that it was snapped at that moment where she's the person that, as you said, looks extremely venomous and upset about all this. And it even, I think the photograph that they use on the front of the book, she might be the only white person that's actually looking at Elizabeth. It looks like in this moment they've turned. All the other white people in the picture are kind of looking off in other directions, or they've turned like something else has got their attention for the moment. So this photograph, it makes it look like she's the only white person that's even focused on Elizabeth in this photo. Going to get to the audio unless we have a final quick comment from any of our listeners. If you are listening and you haven't shared yet, you can do so once the second audio clip concludes. Should be a little shorter than the first one, but I think we will get more information about this photograph. You'll get more details about Hazel as well coming up. Any final thoughts from folks before we get to the second audio clip? Right on. If you didn't get to share, just save it until the second side. The folks that dialed in, if you can mute your line. If you can't do it, I can do it for you, and then I'll unmute once the audio clip concludes. Once again, this is David Margolick, white man, racist suspect. His 2011 publication, Elizabeth and Hazel, Two Women of Little Rock, Context of White Supremacy.
Chapter 4. 5 days after the Brown decision, and more than a year before the High Court offered its ambiguous order for Southern schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed, the Little Rock School Board pledged to comply with the decision. It was in some ways a forward-looking commitment, befitting what the local superintendent of schools, Virgil Blossom, called a friendly, open-handed town where the easy comradeship of the West and the hustling spirit of the Middle West blended with the traditions of the Old South, one garnering considerable attention and applause, a likely model for other cities, U.S. News and World Report declared in 1956. But Blossom, a pragmatist with political ambitions, feared getting too far ahead of public opinion. It took him 3 years to decide to enroll only a token number of blacks in only 3 grades at only one school, Central High School. In May 1957, school administrators set out to find the black trailblazers, children who were simultaneously old enough to attend Central, close enough to get there easily, smart enough to cut it academically, strong enough to survive the ordeal, mild enough to make no waves, and stoic enough not to fight back, and collectively scarce enough to minimize white objections. Black students at Dunbar and Horace Mann were asked that spring whether they wanted to participate in the great experiment. Of the roughly 200 who were eligible, only 80 or so volunteered. Elizabeth was not among them. She couldn't decide anything so momentous so quickly. That was fine with her folks. Though the Eckfords felt black pride, "There's a Negro on television! There's a Negro on television!" someone would shout when Nat King Cole or Harry Belafonte or Ella Fitzgerald appeared on the screen. Elizabeth's parents were hardly activists. What most concerned Oscar Eckford, Jr. was making a living and getting by. When a white woman approached, he instinctively crossed to the other side of the street. If anything, Elizabeth's mother was even more deferential. Her entire career in political activism consisted of collecting signatures once to have streetlights installed in the neighborhood. "I have never had trouble with white people," she told one reporter. "I always gave in if necessary." They'd have been perfectly content had Elizabeth stayed put, continuing her studies at Horace Mann. At Blossom's request, the principals of Horace Mann and Dunbar, which had become a junior high school, winnowed down the candidates to a couple dozen. The superintendent interviewed them all, filtering out those whom he felt might cause problems. One girl, for instance, was too pretty, and scaring away others by telling them everything they could not do. Even were they to be greeted warmly, Central's pioneering black students would not enjoy a traditional high school experience. To mollify white fears of race mixing, they were to be barred from all extracurricular activities. They could not act in school plays, sing in the school choir, go to the prom. "You know, this whole problem of school desegregation could be solved if they'd give us a Negro student who could run the 100 in 9.8 and also throw a decent forward pass," a white student told the New York Post. But under Blossom's plan, that could not happen. Blacks couldn't play on Central's teams, including the famous football Tigers, either. For weeks, Elizabeth weighed whether to add her name to the list. Were she to stay at Horace Mann, her path would be clear and circumscribed. She would surely wind up at Philander Smith, then go on to teach history to black students in some podunk town. Central offered more courses, like speech, that could help her become a lawyer. It also had a far better library. While it had always been off-limits to her, it was also oddly familiar. She passed it all the time en route to her grandfather's store. Summers, she played on its tennis courts, which were integrated long before its classrooms were. As for the ban on extracurricular activities, that posed no problem for her. She was shy by nature, and the Queen of No was actually happier with her home. On the other hand, she knew her parents might suffer retaliation, both could lose their jobs, were she to enroll. Sometime that summer, Elizabeth made up her mind. She wanted to go. Bertie Eckford demurred, hoping her daughter would forget about it. Several weeks passed, and Elizabeth, showing a persistence with her mother that was unusual for her, brought it up again. Wasn't it time, she asked, for her mother to speak to the principal of Horace Mann, Leroy Christoph? Anna lobbied for her, so did her grandfather. Maybe Papa felt that he and I didn't do nothing, so maybe Elizabeth would, her father later said. Christoph told Elizabeth's mother that the list was already complete and that they'd have to go see Blossom himself. When they did, he kept them waiting until all the whites had left the office. An owlish, jowly man, Blossom satisfied himself that Elizabeth had no ties to the local NAACP, which had sued the school board the year before to speed up desegregation, proposing its own slate of students. Blossom wanted none of them. He cautioned Elizabeth that she would have to emulate the black baseball pioneer Jackie Robinson, ignoring all provocations. Elizabeth found Blossom intimidating and patronizing, but a week later he got back to them. Sensitive, brooding, fragile Elizabeth had improbably made the cut. Even more improbably, her worrywart mother went along, not even wavering as the mood in Little Rock darkened. Throughout the summer, a group of segregationists, including several prominent local churchmen, campaigned to halt the Blossom Plan. Cheering them on were racial hardliners throughout the South, who feared that if desegregation, even in so diluted a form, proceeded in Little Rock, their own communities would inevitably follow suit. Advertisements and flyers conjured up black boys and white girls dancing together and kissing in school plays, and warned of venereal disease contracted from communal toilets. A newly formed Mothers League of Central High School sued the Little Rock School Board. Convinced that political survival lay in supporting the hardliners, Phoebus spoke out on their behalf, citing dubious reports that both whites and blacks were stockpiling weapons. Exacerbating race prejudice was class resentment. Little Rock's elite would not fully participate in the plan, just as blacks were entering Central. The brand-new Hall High School, nicknamed Cadillac High, was opening in wealthy Pulaski Heights, and, like the neighborhood, it would be lily white. Thus, the whites bearing the brunt of the change were, by and large, poorer and less educated. Mixed in for them with traditional race prejudice was a more undifferentiated kind of rage. The hate descending upon Little Rock in the summer of 1957 reminded Blossom of what he'd read about Germany in 1933. Quite understandably, some of the black students who'd signed up for Central got cold feet. Soon, only 9 of them remained to enter a student body of approximately 2,000. No man is an island, perhaps, but 9 black boys and girls were about to become an archipelago in an ocean of whites. There's strength in numbers, especially when you're having trouble, Thurgood Marshall told a reporter. 1 student is horrible, and 9 or 10 is bad. Little Rock's black community was small and interconnected, and in addition to Minnie Jean Brown, Elizabeth had ties to several of the pioneering black students. She'd had a crush on the self-assured, highly intelligent Terrence Roberts in junior high, and had seen Carlotta Walls, who was energetic and athletic and had long, thick braids, around the neighborhood. Her mother had once lived with people close to Ernest Green, and Elizabeth knew Ernest, the only senior in the group, as a highly social sort who liked jazz. Thelma Mothershed she'd met through her family. Only Melba Patillo, Jefferson Thomas, and Gloria Ray were complete strangers to her. Collectively, they were what Blossom had wanted, well-mannered children from good families, the offspring of school teachers and postal workers and others in the small black middle class, or those with middle-class aspirations. Most were genuine Jackie Robinson types, sufficiently tough and talented to withstand the inevitable abuse. But anyone in the know could see how hasty and haphazard the process had been. Why pick Thelma, a tiny, fragile girl with a heart defect, or the proud and pugnacious Minnie Jean, or, for that matter, Elizabeth? With her sensitivity and intelligence, she would surely feel whatever punishment was to be meted out more keenly and convey her pain more compellingly should she ever find her voice. Underfunded as they were, Little Rock's black schools had a proud tradition, teaching black pride before the term existed and black history before there were any texts. They represented community and continuity. Some of Elizabeth's teachers had also taught her parents. It was a point of pride that many of them had better credentials, that is, more graduate degrees, than their counterparts in the white schools. The schools provided a refuge from the racism outside. Whatever benefits Central conferred, then, would come at a cost. The very institutions, schools, churches, stores, that insulated Elizabeth from whites, left her largely ignorant about them. When she got to Central, she actually had trouble understanding some of the children. Their accents were too foreign. White people were stick figures to her, exotics whom she scrutinized only to stay safe. Her ignorance extended to the virulence and depth of white antipathy. Part of what would prove so terrifying to her was that it was so unfamiliar, so unexpected. Blossom had directed the black parents to send their children to the first day of school at Central without them. Having adults around, the authorities reasoned, would only inflame things more. Would the soldiers dare block the black students? To the black parents, that seemed hard to believe. In fact, unbeknownst to them, their orders that day were, as one of the guardsmen present later recalled, quite explicit. No niggers in the building. That soldier, a Central graduate himself, knew the school had many black employees, janitors, boil operators, cafeteria workers, the folks who really kept the place going, and asked his superior officer whether exceptions would be made for them. No niggers in the building, the officer reiterated. The local NAACP decided that the black students should not come to school that first day, pending a decision in the segregationists' latest court challenge. But on September 3rd, Federal Judge Ronald Davies, on loan from North Dakota, ordered that the process proceed. Late that night, the principals of Dunbar and Horace Mann informed the 9 black students that they would be going to Central the next day. Daisy Bates, who had taken charge of the group, also called the families. The students should not come individually to Central, as Blossom had requested. It would be too dangerous. Instead, they were to assemble at her home. From there, they would proceed to a spot near the school, where they'd meet with a small group of local ministers, including the few white pastors she'd been able to enlist. The clergymen would then escort the black students to the school. But the Eckfords did not have a phone. As Bates later wrote, she knew that Elizabeth's father worked nights at the train station. She'd have driven down there to tell him the plan had she not been so dog-tired. It could wait till morning. But when morning came, she forgot. Chapter 5. Will Counts was the son of a sharecropper. He'd grown up in Plum Bayou, a community south of Little Rock built by the Farm Security Administration. After World War II, his family moved to Little Rock, and he graduated from Central in 1949. While there, he'd gotten his first camera, a Kodak Brownie Hawkeye. Now 26 years old, he was back at the school, or at least outside it, documenting everything for the Arkansas Democrat. It was his first big story for the afternoon paper, which he'd joined only a few months earlier. Sensing that there'd be trouble, wanting to make sure he wouldn't be mistaken for a carpet-bagging Yankee, he had put on a countrified plaid shirt that morning, something he'd been given the previous Christmas but had never worn. Sure enough, the 3 life photographers attacked that day sported jackets and ties. Slight and youthful, Counts could easily have been mistaken for the student he had only recently been. His hero was Henri Cartier-Bresson, the French photographer who strived to capture the decisive moment, that instant defining the essence of a situation. Counts's task was made easier by his Nikon S2 rangefinder with its wide-angle lens. He could shoot away while his competitors fumbled with their clunky old speed graphics. Alone among the photographers, most of whom had gathered at the other end of the block, Counts had positioned himself toward the north end of the school, not far from where Elizabeth had gotten off the bus. Only he had spotted her, as she approached. Then he went to work. Lots of white people lined Park Street as Elizabeth headed toward the school. As she passed the mobile station and came nearer, she could see the white students filtering unimpeded past the soldiers. To her, it was a sign that everything was all right. But as she herself approached, 3 guardsmen, 2 with rifles, held out their arms, directing her to her left, to the far side of Park, toward all the onlookers. She asked the soldiers for the time. 6 minutes to 8, one replied. She stepped into the street, then resumed her walk. A few steps farther along, she crossed back and approached a different knot of soldiers. This time they closed ranks, then crossed rifles. "Don't let her in," someone shouted. Perhaps she thought she hadn't found the right door. Hadn't Blossom said something about using the main entrance, the one with all the statues on top? By now, a crowd had started to form behind Elizabeth, and her knees began to shake. She continued down Park. For an instant, she faced the school. It just looked so big. The white students, books in hand, continued to walk nonchalantly past the guardsmen. She steadied herself, then walked up to another soldier. He didn't move. When she tried to squeeze past him, he raised his carbine. Other soldiers moved over to assist him. When she tried to get in around them, they moved to block her way. They glared at her. She walked back toward the street where the protesters were concentrated. After she did, John Chancellor approached the soldiers. "You couldn't let her in?" he asked. "We couldn't let her in," one of them replied. Now, as Elizabeth continued walking south down Park, more and more of the people lining the street fell in behind her. Some were Central students, others adults. They started shouting at her. The primitive television cameras, for all their bulkiness, had no sound equipment, but the reporters on the scene scribbled down what they heard. "Lynch her! Lynch her! No nigger bitch is going to get in our school! Get out of here! Go back where you came from! Go home, nigger! Throw her out! Nigger, go back to where you belong! Send her back to the NAACP and Eleanor Roosevelt! You've got a better school of your own!" Looking for a friendly face, Elizabeth turned to an old white woman. It was what she had been trained to do, and besides, there was little choice. 1 in 4 local residents was black, but the crowd that day included no black faces. The woman spat on her. It was the last time that Elizabeth turned her head in any direction. From that moment on, she gazed resolutely ahead. For all the turmoil she felt inside, outwardly, she remained calm. Her sunglasses made her look all the more impassive. One could not look into her eyes, which would have betrayed her fear. Walking backward, the cameramen and photographers recorded Elizabeth's advance. Meantime, reporters pulled up beside her, peppering her with questions. "What's your name? Did you come here to register?" Elizabeth ignored them and kept on walking forward. With the mob at her heels, she felt she could not turn back. A block ahead, she remembered, was another bus stop. If she could only get there, she would be safe. She wanted to run, but feared she might fall down if she tried. So looking straight ahead, she kept on walking. "Lynch her!" someone shouted. "Go home, you burrhead! Send the nigger back to the jungle!" Meantime, Counts took his pictures. He felt sorry for Elizabeth, but he had a job to do. He had picked the right film, Kodak Plus X, good for sunny mornings, but hoped he had read the light correctly, for it was spotty, weaving its way through the still leafy trees. He also hoped he had enough film. There were only 36 exposures on the roll, and by the time he'd recorded the various guardsmen turning Elizabeth away, he had already used up 9. He couldn't just shoot indiscriminately. With things moving so quickly, there would be little time to rewind one spool and load another. 3 young girls, barely into their teens, fell in directly behind Elizabeth. They were clearly together, and clearly students. 2 of them, like Elizabeth, carried books. They wanted to be at the very center of things. And they wanted to get really close to Elizabeth, close enough to let her know that they didn't want her in their school. It was easy. Everyone, the television reporters, the grown-ups in the vacant lot across the street, the other kids, was either egging them on or, like the soldiers and policemen, paying them no mind. No one was telling them not to do anything. 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate, they chanted. Walking closest to Central, carrying a small metallic purse, was Mary Ann Burleson. She had a mild, almost bemused quality on her face, or maybe it was a nervous smile. Later, she recalled that as she shouted, she felt nausea, even a knot in her stomach, as if she knew that what she was doing was wrong. The pretty girl next to her, Sammy Dean Parker, wearing a dark dress with a sailor's ribbon on top, also shouted, though without any great passion. But the girl to her right, Hazel Bryan, looked livid, her face poisoned with hate. As Benjamin Fine of the New York Times later described her, she was screaming, just hysterical, just like one of these Elvis Presley hysterical deals where these kids are fainting with hysteria. Her eyes narrowed, her brow furrowed, her teeth clenched as if about to bite. Hazel shouted, then shouted some more. "Go home, nigger! Go back to Click. Fricka!" Will Counts had his picture. Chapter 6. Unlike many of the rabble-rousers that morning who had come in from the sticks, Hazel Bryan, age 15 and a half, actually lived in Little Rock. But her roots, too, were rural. She had been born on January 31st, 1942, and raised in the hamlet of Redfield, population 100 or so, roughly 30 miles to the south. Her parents had married in 1940. Her father, Sanford, had been 30 years old, her mother, Pauline, only 14. The town's economy revolved around a sawmill. People on both sides of her family worked there. Hazel grew up in a small house with a privy in the back and 2 sycamores her father had planted in the front. Their street ran parallel to the train tracks and Highway 365, which they took periodically to Pine Bluff. In January 1944, 5 days short of Hazel's 2nd birthday, Sanford Bryan had gone off to World War II, leaving Hazel and her younger sister, then only a few months old, behind with their mother, who had taken a job making bombs in the Pine Bluff arsenal. Fighting in France that November, he had taken shrapnel in his hip, shoulder, and stomach, and after a prolonged hospitalization overseas and stateside, had come back to Arkansas with a gimpy, shriveled-up left leg, one that always required him to attach a metal brace to his shoe. Hazel never knew him any other way. One of her earliest memories was of walking alongside her limping father shortly after his return, and of his stopping to take off his bronze star and purple heart and pin them on her chest. Sanford Bryan had been physically active before going overseas. As a young man, he had run away with Ringling Brothers, and his injury left him frustrated and embittered, rough and profane. One night, after mixing alcohol and pills, he'd stumbled into the open sewer in front of the local beer joint and had to be rescued. As Hazel later saw it, it was a botched suicide. So embarrassed was he by his disability and by the unsightly equipment it required, that as much as he'd always liked to swim, only once did Hazel actually see him go in the water. He couldn't really work, so Hazel's mother did. He favored more sedentary pursuits, like playing the fiddle and harmonica and working wood, which he'd do while waiting to shoot squirrels for his family's table. To Hazel, he was more nurturing, more mothering than her mother, forever loading up her and her baby sister and cousin on the back of his truck and taking them swimming or dancing or roller skating. Hazel was his favorite. Whenever her mother or sister wanted something from him, they would always go through her. Sometimes he'd bring Hazel to his favorite bar, stand her up on the counter, and have her sing, with his buddies chipping in afterward to buy her a Coke. Maybe this was when she first realized how much she loved to perform. She had shown some promise in school. Her first-grade teacher once let her spend the night at her home because she was the best reader in the class. But Hazel never cared much about her studies. What she loved was being on a stage, real or make-believe. Of course, there was little place for such things in the fundamentalist Christian faith to which the Bryans had been converted by an itinerant college student who had come through Redfield once selling silverware. From him, and from the purple book he left behind, Hazel first learned how to set a table, something the Bryans had never previously done. Redfield was too tiny to be segregated. Living close at hand were elderly black ladies like Old Nigger Eller and Boot Fanny, who trod the town's unpaved streets in giant rubber galoshes. Nonetheless, there were racial lines. When Hazel's grandmother invited one of the black women onto her porch, her Uncle Charlie had reproached her. One of the old ladies had a dog that followed her everywhere, a fact that amazed him. Imagine that! A dog could love niggers, too. Sometimes Hazel played with black children. Once they pretended to be in church, a black church, of course. They were much more fun, with an upended washboard serving as their pulpit. After one such experience, her daddy had jokingly told her to check her hands. Maybe some of their blackness had rubbed off on her. All this stopped when the black children got a bit older, because there was no place for them to go to school locally. They were around only in the summer. Laura had it that there was some black blood in Hazel's family, that after his wife died, her paternal great-grandfather, who'd had a plantation in Natchez, had taken up with one of his slaves and may have had a child by her. So livid was Hazel's grandfather over this turn of events, the story went, that he renounced his family and family fortune, signing away his rights one night by the headlights of a big city lawyer's Model T Ford. And an aunt on her mother's side had suspiciously kinky hair and big lips. When Hazel was 10, they had moved to the city, so that Pauline Bryan could be closer to the Westinghouse plant where she worked. The family bought a small house in the industrialized southeast part of town known as Biddle Shop. The house was the same size and shape and vintage as the Eckfords, but for the Bryans it was more of a step up, with such unaccustomed luxuries as indoor plumbing, hot water, and a washing machine. Politically, too, the two families were congruent. Both were Democrats. Both had voted for C.O.W.S. The only thing separating them was race. After Redfield, Little Rock seemed positively cosmopolitan. Only there, for instance, did Hazel hear her first symphony orchestra. But the segregation was more pronounced. Her new neighborhood was all white. In fact, she lived right off Confederate Boulevard and past Little Rock's Confederate Cemetery. 640 rebel soldiers are buried there, every day en route to Central. As long as they lasted, Hazel rode on segregated buses, drank out of segregated bubblers, and, though they didn't eat out much, sat at the segregated lunch counters of the 5 and 10 cent stores, without ever thinking much about it. Segregation and integration were, in fact, terms that Hazel barely recognized. When black performers like Bo Diddley came to Robinson Auditorium, there would be separate performances for blacks and whites. To her, blacks were the folks who picked up the garbage or worked and ate in the backs of restaurants. The only black person ever to enter her home was the woman who came occasionally to iron. Hazel liked her. She found her motherly, and used to play sick sometimes just to stay home and be with her. Matters of faith were just as segregated. The East Side Church of Christ had no black members. The preacher put it bluntly, "The birds don't mix, why should the races?" As Hazel remembered it, he'd had this smug, all-knowing smile on his face as he'd said it. Sundays, everyone would sing, "Jesus loves the little children of the world, red and yellow, black and white. We are all precious in his sight." But the lyrics were about as far as it went. Theirs was an abstemious faith. No drinking, swearing, dancing. "A praying knee and a dancing foot don't grow on the same leg," the preacher liked to say. It was a hard regimen for an exuberant young girl to follow. Hazel didn't read the papers much, and knew nothing about the Brown decision except that the grown-ups had grumbled about it, and about Martin Luther King, too, a troublemaker, they called him. As Central's day of reckoning approached, she was almost entirely oblivious. To the extent she had any, her racial attitudes mirrored her parents'. For instance, her father would not let black clerks wait on him, and when stores began hiring black cashiers, he stood in other lines. Of course, he'd also complain that blacks were lazy. The one exception for Hazel was music. She actually preferred Johnny Mathis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry and Fats Domino to Elvis, though she didn't exactly broadcast it. Hazel had entered Central her sophomore year, when she was 14. Though it was all white, it was also stratified. Poor whites like Hazel from Little Rock's east and west sides, next to children from the more affluent Heights, from which the student leaders and academic stars generally came. Her extracurricular activities weren't the sort that made yearbooks. To be more precise, what mattered most were boys, and she was the envy of her girlfriends. All the things teenagers do, dating, dancing, dressing up, she did well. Boys forever buzzed around her. During the 7 nights of the Arkansas State Fair one year, she had 9 dates. A couple of also-rans had to settle for afternoon slots. One suitor, named Billy, actually fired his gun unhappily into the air before she crawled out the window of her house to get him to leave before he woke up her father. Hazel acted and dressed older than she was. She experimented with makeup, and when she wasn't starching crinoline slips for the full-circle skirts that were all the rage, she wore snug sweaters like Marilyn Monroe. Her girlfriends, like Sammy Dean Parker, thought her desperate to get married, which was really just another way of getting out of the house. Hazel met her first real boyfriend, who worked in a parking lot downtown, in the fall of her sophomore year. Billy owned a Ford convertible, and she loved going on drives with him. At Christmas, he gave her a music box that played Let Me Call You Sweetheart. Her parents disapproved of the relationship, and Hazel, feigning illness, played hooky to see him. She failed some courses as a result, and the school summoned her father. Central's vice principal for girls, Elizabeth Huckabee, remembered him as a small, wiry, highly nervous man. Mr. Bryan was sure that Hazel had not been ill, she wrote after the meeting. He hoped, he said, that he would not have to whip her, for he sometimes lost his temper when he did that, and whipped her harder than he intended. Hazel later insisted such things never happened. Feeling the heat, poor Billy broke things off. Ever one for histrionics, Hazel promptly swallowed some aspirin and rubbing alcohol and landed in the hospital, having her stomach pumped. It had been a bit of a performance. She could get down only a little of the stuff, certainly not enough to be life-threatening. But the story made the papers, and Mrs. Huckabee sent the school nurse to check up on her. Hazel bounced back quickly. There was Gary, with a motorcycle, and James, who went on to become a doctor. But the most serious was Mickey, a lonesome young airman whom she met shopping at Walgreens in the spring of 1957 when he was stationed at the nearby military base. Before long he'd given her his class ring, and then they were engaged, or at least he'd bought her a diamond, purchased on layaway before he'd shipped out to England. They agreed that she could date other boys in the meantime. For the hapless airman, that was not a wise move. Hazel's other diversion was Steve's Show, the daily dance party program on a local television station. Every afternoon after school, Hazel hopped on the bus and headed for the studio. It wasn't something a good fundamentalist Christian girl should do, but Hazel loved dancing to rock and roll records and having folks watch her on their brand-new television sets. A forerunner of American Bandstand, which made its debut 6 months later, the program brought together students from all classes of Little Rock. On the dance floor, everyone was equal, as long as they were white. Often joining her was Sammy Dean Parker, whom Hazel had met shortly after her thwarted suicide attempt. Sammy Dean thought of herself as a caregiver, and Hazel was someone who clearly needed care, and could, incidentally, teach her a thing or two about boys. When they weren't dancing together, the two shopped for clothes at Blass or one of the other fancy Jewish department stores downtown. Sometimes they bought themselves matching outfits. In the summer of 1957, as school administrators, police officials, lawyers, and parents braced themselves for desegregation, Hazel and Sammy Dean daydreamed around jukeboxes at Lake Nixon, Windy Beach, or Willow Springs. In the year and a day she'd been going to Central, Hazel had generally taken the bus. But anticipating trouble, her father had driven her on the morning of September 4th, 1957. Unlike Marianne and Sammy Dean, whom she met up with once she arrived, she carried no school books, only her purse and, improbably, a newspaper rolled up in her right hand. Hazel's mother was at the school as well. Alarmed by the reports over the radio, Westinghouse had let parents with children at Central go down to the school to take them home if necessary. But Mrs. Bryan hadn't seen Hazel around the grounds and assumed her daughter had gone inside with the others. Hazel, who never knew her mother was around, would have, too. She hadn't planned on protesting. But she was having too much fun, all those people and reporters and young men in uniforms. Rebuffed by the soldiers, Elizabeth was now making her way toward the bus stop, and Hazel, walking directly behind her, was hamming it up. To the extent she was even thinking about Elizabeth, barely, Elizabeth was less a person than the disembodied stand-in for something she'd been told was foreign and repugnant. The federal government, shoving something down Little Rock's throat. So she started yelling awful things, awful enough for people to notice, even before it was frozen on film. As for Hazel herself, as soon as her words had dissolved in the torpid September air, she had forgotten all about them.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Should have more than 30 minutes left, ample time if you didn't get to share before, to get your views in, thoughts, first study session on David, Margolick's Elizabeth and Hazel, two women of Little Rock. Wowee. As I said, keep it in mind that a white person did write this just for comparison contrast sake, and looking at how same event is viewed, written about when the author is a victim of racism, as opposed to the author being a white person, racist suspect. That said, before I hit the phone lines, I highlighted quite a few passages. If you have the actual hard copy book, they have a photograph of Hazel. She looks like she's maybe 4 or so in this photograph, 3-4 years old. And Shirley Temple. I just put my video project together for Walking Dead, and I was just referencing Shirley Temple, and she looks exactly like the little racist child Shirley Temple in this photograph. They don't have a photograph of Elizabeth Eckford in her younger years when you're reading this book to identify with. I think even that is very skillful by the racist suspect, Mr. Margolick. That's also something we should keep in mind. I think this is the first time that we are doing an audio book where the person who's reading the book is of a different gender than the person who wrote the book. Like all the other books that we've had, that has matched. That might be something just to be aware of as we continue to move through the book. We'll double check some of the folks that were with us before, see if they had anything they wanted to share. I think Be More, and this is 9325. Did you have anything you wanted to share? Oops. Okay, thought that was Be More. Might not be. If that was Be More, my bad. You can press *6 if you have anything you want to share. think I hit the wrong line. Sounds like they were listening, had some audio going on in the background. At any rate, if you dialed in and you want to share, press *6. The number again, 760-569-7676. And the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. One of the quick things, as I said, we should have 9325. Just hop in when you feel like it. If you need some time, that's no problem either. One of the things that I did think was super important, I think we say all the time, confusion is lethal. If you don't understand racism, white supremacy, what it is, how it works, everything else that you do understand will only confuse you. And there were some great passages. It's on page 31 of my book. My pages might not correspond, where they're talking about the black schools and how great they were and how much pride black people had in these schools, that given their children quality education, you didn't have the whole phenomenon of acting white if you are seeking constructive, life-saving information. But they go on to say that when Elizabeth Eckford, when she finally got to Central, she actually had trouble understanding some of the children. Their accents were too foreign to her. White people were stick figures to her, exotics whom she scrutinized only to stay safe. Her ignorance extended to the virulence and depth of white antipathy. Part of what would prove so terrifying to her was that it was so unfamiliar, so unexpected. Now, this is coming from a white person, and he's doing his psychoanalysis of what she was thinking, what her viewpoint was back in 1957, what was going through her brain computer at 16 years of age. But that seems consistent with what we heard from Melba Patilla Beals, what we heard from Carlotta Walls Lanier at the beginning to today's broadcast. Seems to match up with what we've heard before about the black people simply not having an understanding of racism, white supremacy, and being surprised. And I mean, it still happens to this day. It shouldn't even be anything where we're startled, like, oh, what? I can't believe that they didn't understand. Because the same thing happens today, where things are happening to us on the job. We get accused of things, and I can't believe it's 2013. I can't believe a white person would do a thing like that. So, just the importance of having that in mind at all times. And I've heard Mr. Fuller where he has said, never expect correct treatment. Never. As long as we're under the system of white supremacy. And I've heard him give that suggestion before, and people said, that Negro must be crazy. I'm not going out anywhere expecting to be mistreated. But I think that the point gets missed that, hey, we're in a system of racism, white supremacy. It's the purpose of everything all day long is about mistreatment, harm, non-justice, black people, dark people being abused. That's what all this is set up for. That's what's glorified. So anytime that incidents can happen where we can stomp on some black people, that is cause for celebration. And just having that in mind so that you're not caught stumbling and fumbling and not really prepared to give the best response. And I think that's a lot of what you see here. Black people kind of struggling and trying to come up with the best response. As the anecdote says, white people putting you out in a situation that ostensibly is supposed to be a good thing, but you end up just feeling uncomfortable from the very beginning to the very end, and even wondering if they're doing this just to watch you squirm and be at dis-ease as a result of them terrorizing us. Stop there. See here. And the folks, 9325, you should be with us. Not I had some other details, unless you had anything to share.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Oh. Okay, man, what a chapter. It seems that white people will go to any extent to mistreat non-whites, and especially blacks. I made notes of the fact that the philanthropist, Rosenwald, there seems to be some suspicion around his funding of a lot of the black schools in the South on whether or not they received all of the funding that he had allocated to them. Because looking at, this book and thinking about Central High being coined as America's finest school, and the architecture of the school and state-of-the-art facilities and this and that. And then you look at the black schools, and they were designed, with that type in mind, but with inferior type products or on a smaller scale. And, it's just something suspicious about this. We know that the black schools did not receive the type funding as the white schools, but did it begin from the person who was authorizing those funds in the first place? Another point, this book goes a little further into explaining how the selection was made for the 9 students. I think the author did a pretty good job on identifying, small tidbits of each of the students. What was most stood out to me was Hazel's father being 30 years old and her mother's 14 years old. I don't know about the laws, but that seems like statutory rape to me. I mean, how could that be possible? I mean, pedophilia, but I think he married a 14-year-old, and then I believe Elvis Presley married a 14-year-old. I don't know what type of laws existed at that time, but it seems strange to me. Anyway, white people go out of the way to teach the younger people all about their superiority, so-called superiority, to non-whites or blacks. The author referring to different individuals as nigger Ellen or some other racial slur he gave to another black woman, talked about her walking around in rubber galoshes, a dog following him around. This seems like he was making an excuse for the way Hazel thought about black people. She obviously had racist, prejudiced views that was instilled in her. But the most interesting aspect was when they said that she probably had some blacks in her ancestry. And then what her ancestors did, giving up an inheritance just so that they could not be identified as having one drop of black blood. I'll mute my line.
Should have ample time if folks are interested in sharing. Feel free, dial in, participate. If you do not find the material to be constructive, that is fine as well, since I am picking out a turn. If you think this is a waste of time, you can let that be known, and I will be sure to allow listeners to pick the next 2 consecutive books if you feel like this is some foolishness. I thought that passage where they talked about the suspicion that there was some quote-unquote black blood in their family, fascinating as well, where he writes, lore had it that there was some black blood in Hazel's family, that after his wife died, her paternal great-grandfather, who had a plantation in Natchez had taken up with one of his slaves and may have had a child by her. So livid was Hazel's grandfather over this turn of events, the story went, that he renounced his family and family fortune, signing away his rights one night by the headlights of a big city lawyer's Model T Ford. Now that's sort of, you talk about bunkum. That is one of my words of the year. Man, that is textbook bunkum right there, to think that a white person is going to go through all these histrionics and renounce his fame and fortune and all this money that we have made off of enslaving niggers for centuries, and now I'm gonna throw it all away because I'm so ashamed because great-great-granddad raped one of the slaves. I mean, you gotta be kidding. And then this last sentence here for the icing on top, cherry. And an aunt on her mother's side had suspiciously kinky hair and big lips. Now see, for me, and I could be wrong, that a sentence like that I think is just white people clowning, and the author, Mr. Margolick, specifically practicing racism, white supremacy consciously, I suspect. He says in this anecdote that it's her paternal great-grandfather, where there's some suspicion that might be some quote-unquote Negro blood. If it's her paternal great-grandfather, then why would an aunt on her mother's side have suspiciously kinky hair and big lips? To me, that makes no sense whatever. We would be talking about relatives on her paternal side, not relatives on her mother's side, if that's where the alleged bedroom indiscretion took place. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm misreading my little Negro brain trying to make things that are not there. But that is very suspicious. And just the proximity of setting this up as Hazel's a jokester. She's always one for entertaining and dramatics and theater, where it says that she attempted suicide or pretended to attempt suicide after this breakup. And even before that, saying that she would pretend to be ill so that she could stay home with her black mammy, where it's talking about the roles, the limited way that Hazel saw black people. They were custodians. They were to take out the trash, performers, entertainers, and to be separate from white people. It goes and says, to her, blacks were the folks who picked up the garbage or worked and ate in the back of restaurants. The only black person ever to enter her home was the woman who came occasionally to iron. Hazel liked her. She found her motherly and used to play sick sometimes just to stay home and be with her. We heard this in Warriors Don't Cry as well, where Link also had a black mammy figure that he just adored and would give his own allowance money to take care of. But this pretending, right? They make it out that Hazel, she's just a jokester at this age. She's just a precocious young teenager and just doing anything to ham things up. I find that very dangerous and suspicious, because it takes all of that pretending and acting and says that, the day that she's terrorizing Elizabeth Eckford, she was just acting. She was just hamming it up for the cameras. He says Hazel, who never knew her mother was around, she hadn't planned on protesting, but she was having too much fun. All those people and reporters and young men in uniforms, rebuffed by the soldiers, Elizabeth was now making her way toward the bus stop, and Hazel, walking directly behind her, was hamming it up to the extent that she was even thinking about Elizabeth. Barely. Elizabeth was less a person than the disembodied stand-in for something she'd been told was foreign and repugnant. I'll stop there, but that, in my view, is very powerful. The words that are used to frame this incident. No, she's not a racist. She's not even thinking about this black female, this young child. She's not even thinking about her. She is just out here thinking about all these young, handsome young males and the reporters and the cameras, and school has just started, and I'm out in my dress, and I'm trying to look cute for the guys, and I'm just having fun, and I'm upset. I'm letting off a little steam about the man, the system sticking it to us and telling us what we're going to do and shoving something down our throat, which in my opinion is also very sexualized, cowbell ring. But it's a very interesting, in my view, racist way of framing these events. Not holding these white people culpable for being terrorists, her yelling out nigger and all the other stuff that she's saying. No, that's not what it is. She's just having a moment of theatrics. Any young high schooler, would have a moment of just good-natured tomfoolery. That was unfortunate, and it probably did make little Elizabeth feel bad, but she just got caught up in the moment. My thoughts on that. I'll mute my line. Still not really having participation today. Regretful, I know it's been a while since we've been on. Hopefully folks will get back in the groove of things with the book study session and be down to participate as we get kind of rolling into the book. If folks are not interested in just saying, we spent all that time talking about Little Rock 9, it's 2013, let's move forward, current events, that is valid too. That can be voiced. People were saying they just are not interested. As I said, I think there are a lot of lessons in this event. This should be one, depending on the age of listeners. You might be able to contact your parents and get some dialogue going about racism, white supremacy, and just what did they think about these events? Were they watching it on television? See how old they were. If you have younger parents, what they thought about all this. If they were really young, see what they have to say. Could be definitely a good starter piece. And I say, if you have children, I think this will resonate. I think one of the listeners even mailed me, they have a children's book on what happened at Central High in 57. I think a lot, if you have a non-white child, probably anywhere in the world, they should be able to relate to many aspects of this book. Just given the way I was treated in school, I know it would have stuck for me. Let's see. Let's see here. Yeah, I was curious to see how folks thought Hazel, getting more information about her. I was curious to see what listeners make of her and the words that are being used to describe her thus far. Let's see.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You know what? I was hoping also that there would be a female caller that would give us her impression of Hazel, because, I'm kind of hesitant to say, but, she seems to me like a floozy. She seems like, I don't even know the correct word to use, but she seems to be a little loose. If she's climbing out of windows at night to meet boys, her whole agenda seems to be about the next boy that she's going to meet. And it would take a female caller to really, drive this point home. But I know I can't be the only one that's looking at it this way. She, if you look at her life opposed to Elizabeth is a church girl compared to this girl. And the author has nerves enough to describe her as a fundamental Christian. That's stretching it a bit. Thank you.
Great point. And I would just say to compare that with the photograph before you get to her climbing out of windows and attempting suicide and all this other stuff. You got that photograph of her looking like little Shirley Temple, and that's the image that a lot of us have been given for white angels and just purity, fair, all that is wonderful and heavenly in the universe is in that black and white photograph that you get very early on in this book. When you're first learning about Hazel, you got that image. I would say again, you contrast that. You don't have a photograph like that of Elizabeth at the beginning of this book. Very important. But yeah, just the section where it's saying was talking about her exploits as a teenager. Hazel promptly swallowed some aspirin and rubbing alcohol and landed in the hospital, having her stomach pumped. It had been a bit of a performance. She could get down only a little of the stuff, certainly not enough to be life-threatening, but the story made the papers. And Mrs. Huckabee sent the school nurse to check up on her. Hazel bounced back quickly. There was Gary with the motorcycle, and James, who went on to become a doctor, but the most serious was Mickey. Just going on again, just try to imagine that if they were talking about Elizabeth, she had, been dating some boy at 15, attempted suicide over their breakup, patched that up, hooked up with another guy, a motorcycle guy nonetheless, let that go, hooked up with another. Just imagine if that had been the way they had written really about any of the females in the Little Rock Nine. Totally different story. You can even think back, Democracy Now! They did a story on Claudette Colvin this past week. She was one of the first black females, one of many black females who refused to get up on the bus. And they were talking about how people don't know as much about her because she didn't fit the image. She wasn't, the clean-cut, church-going girl, nothing bad in her reputation that white people could come out and try to attack her with. This, not a concern for white people at all. Like, hey, I'm just, as you said, high school floozy and whatever. I'm a good church girl, and I just was into a little tomfoolery that day, got caught up, and unfortunately a picture was snapped that's forever got me looking like some racist, hating bigot. Just a moment of little high school tomfoolery, that's all. I would love to get the author on the program to talk about some of these details in his word choice.
Yes, and the way that the person who's reading the book, she doesn't put emphasis on these lyncher, go back to Africa, nigger, and nigger bitch. I mean, where's the emphasis? How about sounding similar to the way that they were sounding when they said those things? They seem to be, bringing it down a notch when it comes to that, not putting that much emphasis on it, and then spending too much time on Hazel's father, who basically comes off as a bumbling idiot that ran away with the circus. He's injured, walks around with a limp. He's falling in sewers. He had to be drinking a lot, and it don't mention him working. Her mother had to do the work, so I guess the role reversed with him. He stayed at home with the kids. I don't know. He don't sound like a fatherly figure to me, but maybe it's just me.
Yeah, absolutely. Him falling in the sewer. I think it says in it, talking about the embarrassment and the shame of that. She says, or the author, he says, apparently Hazel thought of this as a botched suicide attempt. So, yeah, definitely racist father, leaving a lot to be desired for young Hazel. But I think even that, it plays into the sympathy. I think it, right along with the image and the language that's used in the book, I think it plays on that sympathy of thinking like it's got that conflation, keeps bringing in class, and talking about how the Cadillac High School that's being built, the new one in Little Rock, that's going to be for the really wealthy white people, the affluent white people, and down at Central is more the working class, less wealthy, less powerful white people, really trying that conflation angle and saying, well, she wasn't that wealthy, and look at her dad. He didn't work. He was disabled. He tried to kill himself. He was an alcoholic, and he was disabled. He's got this deformity with his leg. It's not like she had a silver spoon in her mouth, trying to, in my view, it's minimizing. minimizing, doing a lot just with the words and the presentation of the story and how you view these people. I could see folks saying that it's so that you don't think of her as a monster, that it's more complex than that. It's more complicated. It's more nuanced than that. You can't just look at her as some racist monster from back then. You want to have a deeper understanding of this person, which is totally fine, but it's my view. It's just when you get the quote-unquote fuller view, the richer view from racist man, racist woman, racist child, it tends to minimize their culpability on things that they do that practice racism, white supremacy. This would be, in my view, textbook illustration right here, especially the last paragraph in chapter 6. Really the last few pages, but definitely the last paragraph in chapter 6. About 10 minutes left for folks who want to participate, about another 10 minutes.
Gus, did you find it interesting that when Elizabeth was attempting to enter the school, the soldiers blocked her way, but she kept trying to get into the school, like she didn't have a clue that they didn't want her there? I find that hard to believe.
You know, again, it's if I had not, in Carlotta Walls Lanier, in her book, she says the exact same thing, that they listened to Governor Faubus before they attempted to attend for the first time, and they thought if the National Guard is going to be there, they will be there to protect us. They won't be prohibiting our entrance. They'll be there to keep us safe, so things will be better. It seems like all of them, unless, all of them are lying 20 years, 30 years, 40 years after the fact, unless that's happening. It seems like they all had that misunderstanding and thinking that, oh, okay, these white guards are going to be looking out for us. They're going to be there for our safety. They're certainly not going to be blocking and keeping us from entering the school. It seems like none of them really had an accurate grasp of what to expect, what things were going to be like. As crazy as that may seem from this end, we still, even 2013, we see it all the time, every day, where things happen to black people and someone is left saying, I can't believe they would do something like this in 2013. So that's really all I guess that is possible. Maybe they all are lying about it, but I would just say this sounds very familiar to what we heard in Melba Patilla Beals, where she too is saying that she didn't expect. She got way more than what she expected. The same thing in Carlotta Walls Lanier. You heard the words that she was using. She was stunned. She had a disconnect. She was staggered. Just to continue to hear that over and over again, I tend to believe them. Does that make sense? What do you think? Do you remember Melba Patilla Beals saying some of the same things?
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, because I was just thinking today, out of everything that was happening in Melba's book, she had nerves enough to get into an automobile with a white boy, not knowing where they were going, sneak off from her family. That had to be the dumbest part of the book, because the way everything was happening, there would have been no way. And she was almost raped anyway. And then she's going to go get in a car with somebody she don't know and go somewhere. She didn't even know where they were going. I mean, I guess, and like you said, in 2013, we're probably doing some of the same behavior. Trusting, being too trusting of white people, assuming that nothing would happen, not being aware of the danger that you could possibly be in, associated with people that are obviously have a different seating. Their entire culture and belief system is extremely different than yours. They've been even taught to dislike you. And they're so refined now that they can pretend to be your friend and you believe it and let your guards down to your own detriment. It's amazing.
I freed thousands of slaves, and I could have freed thousands more if they had only known they were slaves. The confusion aspect is just one of those things that just can't be underestimated. Say it consistently. That's one of the major ways that the system of white supremacy functions. It's one of those things we just have to, I think, keep in mind. Even amongst people who, say that they are more informed, even they, I think, frequently tend to minimize and underestimate white people. And just to go back to reference that sentence again, the one couple chapters ago, where the black male says that sometimes one was lured into these dangerous situations by an ostensibly friendly gesture. I think that happens a lot as well to confuse the black people, where we end up in these spots just out of confusion and thinking that, oh, okay, this is a good white person. This is something that's going to help me out, and then it turns out to be anything but. Yeah, I think we should all, for the duration of the book, I think we should kind of be on alert for the way that things are written. What are the words that are used to describe when we get more into detail about things that were happening that first year at Central High, things that are happening to Elizabeth and the other 9 students, the treatment of Hazel, how that goes. This is going to breach. We're only going to spend a few chapters of the book actually focused on that year, and then it's going to go forward with their lives, things that happened to them after that year at Central High, and all the other things that they went through in their lives. So it'll be real interesting, I think, just how the book evolves. Looking forward, hopefully, as we are back in the groove, people will participate, dial in, share their thoughts. We haven't got too far in the book, so hopefully people will listen to the archives and be ready to roll next week for the second installment in the study session. Last couple minutes, any final thoughts before we wrap up? I know you had emailed a prayer, I think, to get in at the very conclusion, so we'll get that in. But any final thoughts on the book, last few minutes before we conclude the initial study session?
Yes, I'd like your thoughts on the statement by Frederick Douglass that they used in the beginning of the book, where it said, "My interest in any man is objectively in his manhood and subjectively in my own manhood." Could you give me your thoughts on that?
I would say to start off, Frederick Douglass, that would be let's see. Okay. Wow. I'll just read the quote again before I give my response. "My interest in any man is objectively in his manhood and subjectively in my own manhood." Fascinating quotes. For all the times that I hear Frederick Douglass quoted, I don't think I've heard anyone else reference that particular sentence, much less to start their book off with that sentence. The significance for me in starting this book, being a white man writing about this episode, I would lock on number 1 in the first line, the word objectively. You just mentioned the asili, a concept in Marimba, Dr. Marimba Ani's Yerugu. She talks about this concept of objectivity and being a great tool in the system of racism, white supremacy. She writes extensively about how no one is objective. People are political at all times, and she, in her book, writes explicitly in stating that white people are operating in the political interest of the system of white supremacy at all times. There's no such thing as objective truth. Everyone is operating from a political viewpoint, a political perspective, whether they acknowledge it or not. And if it is a white person, the default perspective is that in support of racism, white supremacy, white domination at all times. So for me reading this, I would say, okay, so my interest in any man is objectively in his manhood. Mr. Margolick doing this book to learn about, present his viewpoint on the victims involved and the white person, to study, to learn about this situation. But then I would look, more importantly, the second line where he says, and subjectively, in my own manhood, what I can learn from this situation that I can use, refining my own skill in racism, white supremacy, how I can even, I would say really with what he's doing with this book, how I can actualize myself as a racist man in writing this book and doing the work to craft how people will view this event. They will end up viewing this event the way I want them to see it, from the perspective that supports racism, white supremacy. That objective can come through in the people that read this book, and maybe giving them my worldview, my way of thinking about these events, this situation, the people that are involved in it, and helping to push along racism, white supremacy, exercising my own manhood as a racist. I think that could be what's going on here. It'll be one, I'll think about it. It's kind of my first thoughts. It's great quote to start off with. Like I said, really nutritious for the brain computer. Since you asked, I'll flip it back. What were your thoughts around this quote? Why do you think a white man would pick this quote from Frederick Douglass to start a book about the Little Rock Nine?
Well, that's why I wanted your view on it. I was, I'm still thinking about it. I mean, I'll have to, look at it some more and maybe see in what context, Frederick Douglass was making this quote, because, I don't know, it seems odd to start your book off with that. And, maybe by the end of the book, we'll know how it all ties in. But I was a little bit confused. And so that's why I wanted your viewpoint. But
great question. It's one to keep in mind. It's the very first thing you get to in the book before you even get to the actual text. So yeah, we'll keep it in mind and read it a few more times as we roll in the book. At least initially, though, it would seem that how I'm reading in the context of this book, how the author sees these events is intimately related with how the author, he sees himself. That seems pretty clear to me from that quote, that there's a deep connection between how he sees himself as a white person and how he sees the events and people involved in the situation that we're going to discuss in this book. But that's great point to revisit. We will make sure to do that in the weeks to come. Hopefully we'll have more participation. It will be good to hear from other listeners. And like I said, comparing and contrasting. We should be building on the information that we've already read. We spent a lot of time talking about these events and even heard from some of the different speeches Bill Clinton has given around these events, and Daisy Bates and Governor Faubus. We've heard from a lot of the integral people, some of the other members of the Little Rock Nine, and we'll have more to come. So we should have a lot to say. Very informed opinions about this book and a white person presenting this info. Looking forward to next week. We'll be back tomorrow with the compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, and 6 p.m. Pacific. Looking forward to catching up since we didn't do the program last week. Dial in, news reports, and looking forward to hearing what folks have been up to in the last couple weeks on the plantation, dealing with all the stress and Easter foolishness. Will be good to catch up. So that'll be tomorrow. Hopefully constructive. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Feedback. Let me know if you what you're thinking about the book. Thoughts on the books. Definitely interested in hearing that as well. Video I did on Walking Dead with my audio commentary. I was not working on YouTube, but I'm looking to get it posted on other sites. If you have information sites where you can post video, longer video, it's going to be about 45 minutes. Let me know. You can email it to me untiljustice@gmail.com, or you can put it on my Facebook page. I want to have the video up. I have another site, but I want to put it up on several sites so people will have easy access to viewing it. I'll get that done hopefully in the next 24 hours. But we'll be back tomorrow. Looking forward to hearing from folks then. To our caller, did you want to do the prayer? I know you emailed it to me. If you want to go ahead and read it yourself, you can wrap us up for this week's program.
Okay, here we go. Creator, we pray for the host and the co-host of this program, the cows. Strengthen and enlighten them so that they may be a beacon of light for those of us whom are more confused. Help us channel our anger, fears, and frustrations towards finding a solution to the greatest problem that plague our planet, the system of white supremacy. Quicken our minds and soften our hearts for other victims of racism. Help us not only to understand, but to overstand isolation. It can be a time spent concentrating on countermeasures to the matrix known as white supremacy. We declare this day we will no longer be hoodwinked or bamboozled, for it has been time to replace white supremacy with justice. Ashe.
Ashe. Ashe. Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thank you all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.